I'd like to call this hearing to order, and today's hearing is entitled U.S. Energy Abundance and the Regulatory Market and Legal Barriers to Export. And I'm going to recognize myself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. I would like to say in the beginning that we do appreciate the witnesses that are here with us today. We have two panels of witnesses, and I'll be introducing you all right before you have an opportunity to give your opening statement. But I would do want to thank you very much for joining with us this morning to discuss this very important issue. And with that, I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. I was reading an article a couple of days ago, and it was talking about worldwide there's 2 or 3 million people, between 2 and 3 million people, who do not have electricity today. Our trade deficit last year in the United States was $539 billion. Our unemployment rate is still pretty high, 7.5% range. Coal consumption is increasing every year worldwide, primarily because of increased use in China, India, and in Asia. In fact, last year we exported 126 million tons, which was above 107, and the projections are that by 2030 it's going to just continue to go up because of the use of coal worldwide. And we all know that having basic electricity is vital to a society functioning, and as I said, our coal is going into some areas that certainly needs help. All of you are very much aware of the abundance of coal we have in America today, recoverable coal. We also are the #1 natural gas producer in the world in 2010 because of recent discoveries in the shale fields. So we have a tremendous opportunity in the U.S. to have a significant amount of export of both coal and natural gas. And it will help decrease our trade deficit. It will help increase the number of jobs available in America. And I think about the railroad industry that's moving a lot of coal and oil today. And just one railroad, the Burlington Northern Santa Fe, I was talking to some of their people recently, they're spending about $4.3 billion a year just maintaining their railroads, and you multiply that by the number of the railroads around the country, and no government money involved in it. So we have private enterprise putting in money to create jobs in America to export a product and products, or at least the potential of doing it, that the world wants and the world needs. And so today's hearing, we're going to focus on what are the obstacles to this, because we all know that there are significant obstacles. There are regulatory obstacles, market obstacles, permit obstacles, and then a lot of lawsuits are being filed. Mayor Bloomberg alone gave $50 million to the Sierra Club, basically to file lawsuits against the coal industry. And I'm a fan of the Sierra Club, and I'll be the first to say that they have done a lot of good in America. But at the same time, when you're deliberately filing lawsuits to stop jobs from being produced in America, I think that's not something that we need very much of. I still have 1 minute and 30 seconds left, so I'd like to yield the balance of my time to the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Scalise.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. If you look at the barriers to export, I know when South Louisiana, the first LNG facility that's been permitted, Cheniere, is spending billions of dollars. This is all private money to be able to export natural gas. It's something that I think if you look across America, there are going to be more opportunities as we explore this revolution in shale with hydraulic fracturing and horizontal drilling. The things that it's opened up, the opportunities not just to create jobs for America, for Americans, to create billions of dollars in economic activity in the states that have chosen to be a part of this revolution, but also it's allowed America not only to be energy independent in terms of natural gas, which has been great, not just for natural gas, but for manufacturing in our country. It's kind of re-industrialized a lot of the chemical facilities, a lot of the other facilities that we're looking at moving out of the country because it's provided a stable source of energy. But it's also provided us an opportunity to export energy, which is something that we should be looking at doing more of because, again, this allows us to be competitive. It allows us to bring that trade balance down. And so if you look at the threats to the ability to export more, a lot of these are coming from federal agencies right now. So we had the Secretary of Energy last week talking about energy independence and all of the above, and this is part of it. So I appreciate the focus, Mr. Chairman. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. This time I'd like to recognize the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Rush, for a 5-minute opening statement.
I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank the witnesses for appearing before the subcommittee today. Mr. Chairman, I commend you for holding today's timely hearing on the potential impacts of exporting both coal and LNG to overseas markets. There's no doubt in my mind that the energy sector will play a huge role in helping to get the American economy back on track, while also creating the jobs and the economic opportunities that can benefit all sectors of the American population. Just as I believe that energy will play a substantial role in helping to bolster the U.S. economy, I also believe that the increased production of natural gas will play a crucial role within the energy sector of helping us become more competitive and energy independent. With the new technologies of hydraulic fracturing and horizontal drilling, we are already seeing natural gas production defy expectations of only a few years ago, when most experts believed that the U.S. would need to become a net importer of natural gas in order to meet its domestic demand. However, today, Mr. Chairman, through the increased use of fracking and horizontal drilling, we have seen natural gas production in the U.S. rise by 34% between 1990 and 2012. And the EIA projects that under existing policies, natural gas production will increase by an additional 39% by 2040. Even with the EIA predicting that domestic consumption of natural gas will increase modestly in the electric, industrial, and to a lesser extent the transportation industries, the agency still expects for the U.S. production of natural gas to outpace demand, resulting in the U.S. becoming a net exporter of natural gas by 2020. Which brings us to today's hearing, Mr. Chairman, where we will have the opportunity to hear from relevant stakeholders from within federal agencies and from within industry on the regulatory, market, and legal barriers to exporting natural gas, as well as the potential impacts and the unintended consequences of making these exports. It is my hope that today's hearing will shed more light on important issues associated with exporting LNG and coal, including the impact on domestic prices, the potential for jobs, the effect on our manufacturing base, as well as the effect on the U.S. trade balance. Additionally, Mr. Chairman, after a record-setting 2012, where we witnessed an historical number of heat waves, wildfires, flooding, and drought, And with 2013 already showing signs of record-breaking tornadoes, wildfires, and hurricanes sweeping across our nation and destroying lives and property, it is imperative that we also hear about climate change as we debate whether to export coal and LNG overseas. As policymakers, it is our duty to understand the totality of the consequences for the decisions we make in regards to exporting coal and LNG. Mr. Chairman, with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Rush. At this time, I recognize the Chairman of the full committee, Mr. Upton, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. America's energy landscape is indeed changing for the better, creating opportunities for jobs, economic growth, energy security, and an enhanced standing around the world. But this bright energy future is far from guaranteed. Federal laws and regs that are stuck in the past could devastate newfound opportunity, in addition to an administration that sometimes seems more intent on rewarding a handful of environmental activists, allies, rather than capitalizing on our new energy abundance that certainly would create jobs and stimulate the economy for the benefit of all. According to CRS, America has the largest fossil fuel reserves of any nation on Earth, and estimates keep growing because of technological advances. At the same time, the global demand for energy is on the rise. According to the World Bank, more than 1.2 billion people, that's B as in big, 17% of the world's population, are still without access to electricity. So when you put two and two together, the U.S. has the potential to become the world's preeminent supplier of affordable and reliable energy. And with common sense planning and continued safe and responsible development, our country can indeed help to take the power back from OPEC and geopolitically unstable regions of the world and be a force of change to help bring nations out of poverty with our energy resources. We're already seeing increased exports of coal. Rapidly rising domestic natural gas production is likely to become the next American-made energy source to reach the global market. And as a recent report conducted for the DOE concluded, America can export a portion of its natural gas abundance while, in fact, still maintaining affordable domestic supplies to continuing to power our manufacturing renaissance. All that's missing is the additional infrastructure to make expanded exports possible. And achieving our export potential would have the added benefit of creating thousands, tens of thousands of new jobs. Unfortunately, the buildup of red tape over the last couple of decades has become a real obstacle, especially for the kinds of major projects that will be needed, such as pipelines, ports, and LNG facilities. The cumbersome federal approval process is out of step with where we are as an energy-producing nation today. And that's partly due to the ingrained mindset of energy scarcity that has proven slow to change, despite the dramatic and unexpected rise in domestic energy supplies. But it's also due to overlapping laws and regs that create multiple opportunities for delays and for litigation. Keystone Pipeline is a perfect example of the kind of project delays that we're talking about. We've been waiting for nearly 5 years for federal approval, and when it comes to the projects necessary to expand exports, thereby increasing jobs, improving our trade balances, we should not have to wait that long. Just as we're putting jobs at risk by failing to approve Keystone, we may forego jobs and economic growth by not pursuing energy export projects in a timely fashion. The private sector has made rapid progress in unlocking our energy abundance. What the American people now need is a regulatory process that can keep up with the evolving energy landscape. And are there other members wishing? I'll yield the balance of my time to Mr. Barton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There are three things that we need to know with regards to natural gas exports. Number one, we're the world's largest producer of natural gas. Number two, we have the world's largest amount of reserves of natural gas. And number three, we have the world's cheapest price. Prices in the United States are a third of less than half the price over in Europe, less than a third of the price in Asia, and less than a fourth of the price in South America. It would seem it's a win-win if we could license some export facilities, get these natural gas products overseas, bring the wealth back from overseas that pays for it, and use that to create more jobs in America. The same thing can be said on coal. The good news on coal is it doesn't have some of the regulatory requirements for export that natural gas does. So, Mr. Chairman, I think this is a good hearing, and I look forward to hearing from the witnesses. I'll yield to whoever.
Gentleman yields back. This time, recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Waxman, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today's hearing will focus on the export of liquefied natural gas and coal. These are complex issues, and it's important for the subcommittee to understand how they relate to our energy policy. There are multiple factors to consider when evaluating exports. Proponents of increasing our exports of natural gas and coal stress that exports can help our balance of trade and create new economic opportunities. Opponents raise a number of concerns ranging from potential environmental harm to price impacts for U.S. consumers and manufacturers. In my view, a key factor on this issue, as on so many other energy issues, is climate change. Climate change is the biggest energy challenge we face. We can't have a conversation about America's energy policy without also having a conversation about climate change. The energy policy decisions we make today will have an impact on whether we can prevent the worst impacts of climate change in the future. We need to understand and weigh those risks. Otherwise, we're in danger of locking in infrastructure that will produce carbon pollution for decades to come, or creating stranded investments that must be shut down before they've served their useful life. Last week, the International Energy Agency released a report concluding that the world is not on track to meet the goal of limiting global average temperature to rise no below 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit above the pre-industrial levels. Climate scientists tell us that if global average temperatures increase beyond this threshold, society will face devastating impacts. It is not too late to keep temperatures below the most dangerous levels if we act now to cut carbon pollution. The International Energy Agency found that taking key actions now to reduce emissions could be done at no net economic cost, while delay would impose trillions of dollars in costs on society. It's through that lens we need to examine whether to construct new export terminals to ship America's natural gas and coal overseas. Liquefied natural gas and coal export terminals are huge, multi-billion-dollar investments that will last for decades. It would make no sense to build these facilities only to find out that they are unsustainable because of the climate implications. I have an open mind about natural gas exports. Natural gas combustion for electricity emits less carbon pollution than coal. If natural gas exports displace coal consumption, that could produce a significant net climate benefit, especially if we tackle the problem of fugitive methane emissions. On the other hand, if natural gas exports raise gas prices in the United States, that could cause some utilities to switch back to coal, erasing some of the carbon pollution reductions that our country has recently achieved. We should fully understand these climate impacts before these facilities are built, not after. With respect to coal exports, the United States and the rest of the world need to reduce our dependence on carbon-intensive fuels like coal and move towards a cleaner, low-carbon energy future. Building billions of dollars in new infrastructure that guarantees China a steady supply of cheap coal for decades to come is the opposite of what we should be doing. Governor Inslee of Washington State, Governor Kitzhaber of Oregon, the two states that would be most directly affected by new coal export terminals, wrote a letter to the White House on this very point. They argued that, quote, before the United States and our trading partners make substantial new investments in coal generation and the infrastructure to transport coal, extending the world's reliance on this fuel for decades, we need a full public airing of the consequences of such a path. And they call on the White House to thoroughly examine this matter. I agree with these governors. If we do not, at the very least, understand the consequences of our energy policies before we implement them, I think we would be making a mistake. I thank our witnesses for appearing today, and I look forward to your testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Waxman. At this time, I'd like to introduce the first panel, and as I said in the beginning, we appreciate your being with us. Thank you for coming, and we look forward to your comments. First, we have Mrs. Jennifer Moyer, who is the Acting Chief Regulatory Program at U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. We have Mr. Jeff Wright, who is the Director, Office of Energy Projects at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. And we have Mr. Christopher Smith, who's the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary and Acting Assistant Secretary of Energy, for fossil energy, at the Department of Energy. So thank you for joining us, and each one of you will be recognized for 5 minutes for an opening statement. And if you would remember to pull the microphone close to you and just be sure to turn it on. And when your time's expired, there's 2 little boxes and the red light will go on. So Ms. Moyer, we'll recognize you for your 5-minute opening statement. Thank you.
Thank you. Chairman Whitfield, Ranking Member Rush, and members of the subcommittee, I'm Jennifer Moyer, Acting Chief of the Regulatory Program for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss the Corps' regulatory authorities under Section 10 of the Rivers and Harbors Act of 1899 and Section 404 of the Clean Water Act. I will specifically discuss the Corps' role in permitting of shipping facilities with a focus on coal and the issues currently being discussed in the Pacific Northwest. The responsibility for making final permit decisions has been delegated to our 38 district commanders. They are the closest to the proposed activities, have staff and expertise to evaluate applications, and know the aquatic resources and navigation issues involved. Section 10 permits are required for work in navigable waters of the U.S., while Section 404 permits are required for the discharge of dredged or fill material into waters of the United States. First, a little background on the existing shipping terminals along the Gulf Coast and East Coast, which have accounted for most U.S. coal exports over the past 10 years. Depending on originating and export facility locations, coal is shipped over existing rail networks or by barge on our nation's inland waterway system. In 2012, total U.S. coal exports increased about 126 million tons due to a substantial increase in the amount of steam coal exported, which is used for generating electricity. The National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, mandates that agency conclusions be supported by critical thinking and reasoned analysis of the potential environmental consequences of a proposed agency action, such as a decision on a pending permit application. The Corps first identifies the federal action under consideration and then decides whether we have sufficient control and responsibility for activities outside of our regulatory jurisdiction, that is, waters of the United States, such that the issuance of a Corps permit would amount to approval of those activities. The Corps limits its review to only the specific activity requiring a Corps permit and those portions of the activity over which the Corps then has sufficient control and responsibility. The Corps is evaluating shipping facility proposals at 3 separate and independent locations in the Pacific Northwest. These 3 facilities have generated considerable public interest, in part because these facilities' primary purpose would be to receive coal via rail from the Powder River Basin in Wyoming and Montana for shipment via barges and ocean-going vessels to other locations, including Asia. When considered in accordance with the laws and regulations I've discussed above, many of the activities of concern to the public, such as rail traffic, coal mining, shipping of coal outside of U.S. waters, and the burning of coal overseas, are outside of the Corps' control and responsibility. These activities are too far attenuated and distant from the proposed activities being evaluated by the Corps to be considered effects of the Corps' permit actions. The Corps expects to receive many comments from the public and from sister federal, state, and local agencies, and especially from tribes, on these issues, and we will carefully consider all the comments we receive. Based on anticipated direct, indirect, and cumulative impacts, the Seattle District is currently preparing a draft environmental impact statement for the Gateway Project and a separate draft environmental impact statement for the Millennium Project. For the Coyote Island project, the Portland District is currently preparing an environmental assessment. The three proposed projects are not a Corps plan or a program, therefore preparation of a programmatic EIS in this case is not appropriate. Because they are independent projects at different locations whose impacts are not related and they are unconnected single actions under NEPA, preparation of an area-wide or regional EIS is not appropriate based on our review of pertinent regulations. Based on these facts, we have determined that preparation of neither a programmatic EIS nor an area-wide or regional EIS is appropriate. The scope of analysis established by the Corps in the review of each proposal will include the specific activity required by a Corps permit, the environmental effects or impacts of that specific activity, and those portions of the entire project over which there is sufficient federal control and responsibility to warrant a Corps NEPA review. The preparation of the NEPA documents for these projects, all three of them, is at an early stage. In summary, our Seattle and Portland districts are reviewing these proposals and carrying out the NEPA scoping process to determine which potential environmental effects to analyze in detail. The Corps districts will carefully consider each of these proposals while appropriately bounding the scope of analysis and consideration of the impacts in accordance with existing regulations, policies, and guidance. I appreciate the opportunity to be here today and will be happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Ms. Moyer. And Mr. Wright, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Whitfield, Ranking Member Rush, and members of the subcommittee, my name is Jeff Wright, and I am the Director of the Office of Energy Projects at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. The Office of Energy Projects is responsible for, among other things, the authorization and oversight of the construction and operation of onshore and nearshore liquefied natural gas terminals. Today I will discuss the process which the Commission uses to review applications for facilities for the export of LNG. With respect to LNG, the Commission is an environmental and safety regulatory agency. The Commission does not authorize the import or the export of LNG. That authority rests with the Department of Energy. Accordingly, applications for authority to import or export LNG must be submitted to DOE, while applications for the construction and operation of import or export-related facilities must be submitted to the Commission. The Commission's review process is comprised of three distinct phases: pre-filing review, application review, and post-authorization review. Each stage of the review process requires the submission of detailed information that involves a review and consultation with key stakeholders and other federal agencies such as the Coast Guard and the Department of Transportation. Section 311 of the Energy Policy Act of 2005 requires prospective applicants seeking Commission authority to construct and operate an LNG terminal to participate in a pre-filing process for a period of at least 6 months. This is the beginning of the Commission's staff review, and it involves not only an early analysis of the project proposal, but also provides a transparent forum for consultation and discussion. The pre-filing process is designed to engage all stakeholders in order to identify and resolve potential issues related to the construction and operation of a facility before the filing of a formal application. During this process, project-specific issues are raised throughout the environmental scoping process and/or by other means such as open houses, public meetings, site visits, and/or filed comments. At this stage, information needs are identified and studies are conducted as necessary to fill data gaps. The end of the pre-filing process occurs when the applicant files its formal application. Once the formal application has been filed, any person can move to intervene in the Commission's proceedings. Interveners become parties to a proceeding and have the right to request rehearing of Commission orders and seek relief of final agency actions in the U.S. Circuit Courts of Appeal. In addition, all interested parties have the opportunity to place their concerns regarding the project into the record and file any evidence they feel is important for the Commission to consider. During the application review phase, the Commission staff analyzes the formal application, and once sufficient information to address environmental and safety issues exists in the record, it establishes a schedule for the production of the environmental review documents. The environmental document is then issued for public comment, and comments received on that document are addressed. The final environmental document contains staff's conclusions regarding the feasibility, safety, and environmental impacts associated with the proposed facilities. The document also includes any recommended measures for ensuring safety and mitigating any environmental impacts identified through analysis of the proposal and consideration of concerns raised during the pre-filing and application review. After issuance of the final environmental document, the Commission considers the entire record of the proceeding. If the Commission finds that the environmental and safety impacts from the construction and operation of the LNG facility are acceptable and authorizes the proposal, the project-specific mitigation measures recommended in the environmental document are included as conditions to this authorization. During the post-authorization review phase, detailed plans for the Commission-required mitigation are developed. Approval of these detailed plans must be received before construction can commence. During the construction period, mitigation measures are implemented and monitored. As part of its ongoing detailed post-authorization project review, staff inspects the construction in progress to ensure that all required measures are implemented. Inspections during construction entail the review of quality assurance and quality control plans, nonconformance reports, and cool-down and commissioning plans to ensure that the installed design is consistent with the safety and operability characteristics of the proposal approved by the Commission. Finally, at the end of construction, the project sponsor will file a request for authorization to commence operation of the facility. The information contained in this request must demonstrate how the project sponsor has complied with all of the Commission's requirements and must be consistent with the results of the Commission's inspections. This final authorization from the Commission will not be granted unless all measures to ensure safe and secure operations and the necessary environmental protections are in place and serving their intended purpose. Once a facility is placed in service, it is subject to continuing inspections by the FERC staff for the life of the facility. This ensures that the facility continues to be operated and maintained in accordance with the Commission's original authorization. This concludes my testimony. I'll be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Wright. And Mr. Smith, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Whitfield, Ranking Member Rush, and members of the subcommittee. I appreciate the opportunity to discuss the Department of Energy's program regulating the export of natural gas, including liquefied natural gas. The Department's authority to regulate the export of natural gas arises from the Natural Gas Act, which provides 2 statutory standards for processing applications to export LNG from the United States. One for export to free trade agreement nations and one for export to nations with which the United States does not have a free trade agreement. By law, applications to export natural gas to free trade agreement nations are deemed consistent with the public interest, and the Secretary of Energy must grant authorization without modification or delay. As of today, the Department of Energy has approved 24 long-term applications to export lower 48 LNG to free trade agreement countries, and there are 3 that are currently pending. For applications to export natural gas to non-FTA nations, the Secretary of Energy must grant the authorization unless, after opportunity for hearing, the proposed export is found to not be consistent with the public interest. The Department's review of applications to export LNG to non-FTA countries is conducted through a publicly transparent process which includes full public interest review. To date, the Department has granted 2 long-term applications to export domestically produced lower 48 LNG to non-FTA countries. In the Sabine Pass order, the Department of Energy stated that it would evaluate the cumulative impact of that authorization and any future authorizations for export authority when considering subsequent applications. Following the issuance of that order, the Department of Energy undertook a 2-part study of the cumulative economic impact of LNG exports, to which we received over 190,000 comments. On May 17th, the Department of Energy granted the 2nd long-term application to export LNG, which was granted to Freeport LNG in a conditional order pending successful environmental review. The order was granted after an extensive, careful review of the application, the LNG export study, public comments for and against the application, and public comments of the cumulative impact of LNG exports filed in the LNG export study. Currently, the Department of Energy has 20 non-FTA export applications pending. Going forward, the Department will continue processing the pending applications on a case-by-case basis, following the order of precedence previously established and set forward on the Department of Energy's website. Finally, the Department will assess the impact of any market developments on subsequent public interest determinations as further information becomes available. Due to the adjudicatory nature of this process, Mr. Chairman, I will be unable to comment today on issues that are presently being addressed in our pending proceedings. However, I can speak to the Department of Energy's statutory authority, our process to review applications, our two-party LNG export study, the comments we received on those studies, and other recent developments in LNG export. With respect to these topics, the Department and I are committed to being as responsive as possible to any questions that the committee may have. In conclusion, Mr. Chairman, I would like to emphasize that the Department of Energy is committed to moving this process forward as expeditiously as possible. We understand the significance of this issue as well as the importance of getting it right. Thank you.
Thank you all very much for your testimony. We appreciate your being with us, as I said. And Ms. Moyer, let me ask you a couple of questions here. You said what was the word you used, deputy commander or division commander? You had 38 division commanders, is that right?
District commanders.
District commanders. And they have the authority to make the final decision on, for example, Port Morrow's application?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Now, the President recently had made comments that he was considering requiring all federal agencies to consider the climate change effect, including global impacts of their actions. This is an unprecedented step with far-reaching geopolitical implications that it effectively puts the U.S. in the position of evaluating the energy consumption choices and environmental policies of our trading partners. Now, in your testimony, you stated that the ultimate burning of coal overseas is outside the Corps' control and responsibility. So does this mean, for the purposes of NEPA, that the Corps of Engineers does not intend to consider the climate change impacts related to any of the three, for example, proposed facilities in the West that have applied for a license for export?
With respect to climate change or greenhouse gas emissions, the Corps will limit its focus on emissions to those emissions that will be associated with the construction of the facilities.
Right.
So those impacts that will occur within our scope of analysis, our limited scope of analysis. But the appropriate application of our regulations have led us to the conclusion that the effects of the burning of the coal in Asia or wherever it may be is too far removed from our action to be considered as an indirect effect or a cumulative effect of our action itself.
Right, which I think is a right decision. You also indicated in your testimony that the Corps is not planning to complete an area-wide environmental impact statement for the three export terminals currently pending before the Corps as one entity. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
So you do intend to proceed each one of those individually?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Which I think also is the right decision. I know that there are groups out there that want an area-wide environmental impact statement, which certainly makes it a lot easier to create obstacles and lawsuits and so forth. So I appreciate that very much. Mr. Wright and Mr. Smith, would one of you just clarify for us the different responsibilities that you have for the liquefied natural gas export facility? Mr. Wright, the Department of Energy, I guess, authorizes. Is that correct?
The Department of Energy, and I'll let Mr. Smith speak to that, but in my knowledge, the Department of Energy authorizes the import or the export of the physical commodity. FERC, or the Commission, authorizes the facilities to facilitate the import or the export of the commodity.
Mr. Smith?
Mr. Chairman, that's exactly correct.
Okay. And so far, you've authorized 2 facilities to non-free trade areas. Is that correct?
I believe the Department of Energy has authorized 2 exports to non-free trade agreement projects, the Commission has authorized the construction of one facility, and that's Cheniere's Sabine Pass facility for export.
Right, right. Yeah, thanks for reminding me. I keep, Mr. Smith at the Department of Energy, you're at FERC, so thank you. Well, okay, that's all the questions I have for now, so Mr. Rush, I'd recognize you for 5 minutes.
I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman. Your questions have been quite interesting, and the testimony has been informative, and has touched on the issue of LNG exports from a myriad of perspectives. But my concern is I would like to also hear more about exporting LNG and how it would impact U.S. consumers. Unlike oil prices, which is set on the global market, natural gas prices are set on a regional scale in North America and Europe and Asia. Today, Americans are paying very low prices for natural gas, less than $4 per gallon as opposed to $10 in Europe and $12 or $15 in East Asia. Most experts, however, expect this price to increase over the coming years, with the EIA estimating that the Henry Hub spot prices for natural gas will increase by 2.4% as producers begin drilling in more difficult terrain. The question I have is how will exporting in LNG impact the cost of natural gas for American families and consumers and American businesses, manufacturers? And will this impact be significant, and will it be widespread across many different sectors of our economy? Mr. Smith, you want to take a stab at that?
Yeah, thank you, Congressman, for that question. So as the Department of Energy goes through its process of evaluating these applications to export LNG, we are keenly aware and concerned about the potential impacts on American businesses, on American families, issues that might be related to changes in the price for natural gas. We certainly see that there's a tremendous opportunity that our country has in terms of our large natural gas resources. We want to make sure they're being developed prudently and that we're making good public interest determinations in terms of export decisions. As part of that, as I mentioned in my oral testimony, when we put out the Sabine Pass order, the Department of Energy declared that it would consider the cumulative impacts of LNG exports, which was the reason why we commissioned a comprehensive study that looked at not only impacts here in the United States, but also the global market's capability of absorbing LNG into other markets internationally. The conclusion of that study was overall that the impacts of LNG exports would be positive for the consumers. There would potentially be some price impacts as you have additional demand that's placed on our supply based on exporting LNG. But the conclusion of the study that was done for DOE concluded that overall for our economy and for American consumers it would be positive.
I have an additional question, and I think this question centers around the issue of jobs. Would there be an overall gain or loss in manufacturing jobs and other types of employment if we started exporting LNG? And how would exporting LNG impact jobs overall in the U.S.? And you and any of the other witnesses can chime in on this, the answer to this.
Well, thank you for the question, Congressman. So we did look very closely at economic impact and jobs. You certainly have a potential positive impact from the construction activity of building the terminal of actually producing the gas to be exported. The concern that was raised by some opponents of LNG exports was that potential price rises might have a negative impact on energy-intensive users of natural gas, like chemical plants or some manufacturers. The evidence that we looked at said that in balance, that LNG exports at various levels would be positive for the economy, positive.
Mr. Wright, would you want to chime in on this?
Well, we don't get into the economic analysis, but in terms of approving construction, obviously when you build something, there will be jobs there, and there will be.
Ms. Moyer, would you?
Certainly when we're evaluating applications from a private entity for a facility, we look at cost implications. We aren't looking at economic benefits and detriments.
We don't have any infrastructure for any of this, right? And the question is, where is the infrastructure going to come from, and how much will it cost?
Well, there's if you look at the Sabine Pass terminal, the Sabine Pass terminal was actually an LNG import terminal that's being converted into an export terminal. So there's already a footprint that's going to be expanded in order to make that conversion to export LNG. But for all of these investments, there's going to be significant multi-billion-dollar capital investments that are required in order to create the capacity to export LNG.
Gentleman's time has expired. This time, I recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Barton, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before I ask my questions, I want to say welcome to Mr. Bill Cooper, who's on the second panel. He's a former staffer for the Republican staff of Energy and Commerce Committee, and we're glad to have him here in the audience. And welcome him. I want to ask a question to Mr. Smith. I have never seen a longer title. The Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary and the Acting Assistant Secretary for Fossil Energy. That's quite a mouthful. How many Deputy Assistant Secretaries for Fossil Energy are there, since you're the principal one?
Well, I have a long title because I'm wearing a lot of hats right now. I'll say that the chairman nailed the title when he was introducing me, so thank you for that.
Yeah. I do want to also make sure that I understand this. I'm told that in a past life you actually worked for Chevron. Is that correct?
I worked for Chevron and actually grew up in Fort Worth, Texas, not exactly in your district.
And,
but,
and yet you still got appointed to your position. Congratulations.
I was actually appointed to my position because of my specific industry background. So
that's good. That's very good. Well, my first question, I'll ask you, Mr. Smith. Does the law stipulate which entity has to be applied to first for an export permit? Do you have to get approved at DOE to export LNG, or could you go directly to FERC and ask to have the facility approved before DOE has approved that it could be exported, or does it matter?
yeah, the law actually gives us some flexibility, and it gives applicants some flexibility. So the way that we've handled that question is we have to come up with some order in which we're going to consider applicants. So applicants are free to apply to FERC. They're free to apply to the Department of Energy. But we've given priority to those applicants who have already started that FERC pre-filing process, which is the process which you're starting to spend real money. And we're also considering those applicants on a first-come, first-served basis with priority given to those who have started their FERC pre-filing process.
The law doesn't stipulate it, and the practice is that an entity can apply either place, but the DOE gives preference to those applicants that have already started the facility permitting process at FERC. Is that correct?
We are considering first those applicants who have started their FERC pre-filing process.
Okay. And is this go either place first policy going to be maintained, or is there a possibility that you might clarify it and set some specific criteria as to what you have to do first?
Well, the department looked at a lot of factors when we were considering the order in which we're going to rule on applications. There's a lot of ways that we could have done that. We could have looked at business models. We could have done other evaluations. But the standard that we had was we wanted something that was open, that was transparent, that was simple, that was fair, and that helped us push the project that might be more viable to the front of the queue. So we wanted a very subjective standard that didn't have some, a very objective standard that didn't have some subjectivity where we had to evaluate business models. So that's the order that we're moving forward on. There's a PDF on the Fossil Energy website that lists those applications in order, and that's the process that we're using going forward.
Okay. And Mr. Wright, does FERC have a timetable for its review of its process? Do you try to get the permit to build and construct done in so many months, so many years? Do you have a guideline for that?
Well, we do, and we're in relatively new territory with export applications for construction. The import applications, the regasification facilities, were much simpler, and given that we would get all the information we would need, including the pre-filing period, we would authorize LNG import facilities somewhere between 18 to 24 months. With export facilities, the engineering is much more critical. It's much more safety conscious, environmental conscious because of the use of refrigerants and natural gas liquids. What we're seeing is we are very dependent upon the applicant being able to finish its engineering studies to supply us with the information for our evaluation.
My time has expired, but could you give us you try to get your review done by X months, is there an X that you use, or is that not possible?
We would love to get our formal application review done in 18 to 24 months.
18 to 24 months. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's time has expired. At this time, I recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Waxman, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Moyer, the Corps has been asked by Governor Inslee of Washington State and Governor Kitzhaber of Oregon and others to prepare an environmental impact statement that looks at the cumulative impacts of the proposed West Coast coal export terminals. They've asked that this analysis include an impact exporting U.S. coal to China on climate change. In your testimony, you appear to reject this request. You state, quote, shipping coal outside of U.S. territory and the ultimate burning of coal overseas are outside the Corps' control and responsibility, end quote. Ms. Moyer, is this accurate? Has the Corps of Engineers decided not to examine the climate impacts of these coal export terminals as part of its environmental impact statements?
What we've determined is that the effects of shipping of the coal outside of U.S. waters and the burning of the coal wherever its ultimate destination would be is outside of our scope of analysis. However, the climate change effects or the emissions associated with the activities within our scope of analysis, such as the construction activities associated with building the facilities, the emissions that may be associated with the increase in vessel traffic, those types of effects that may have an impact on climate change will be associated with our analysis for each of the facilities.
Well, Ms. Moyer, I think the Corps is making a big mistake. As I understand it, some of the most important responsibilities of the Corps of Engineers are to protect navigable waters, to protect cities like New Orleans from flooding, to protect beaches and coastlines, and to ensure that major waterways remain open to commerce. Is that correct?
Yes.
All of these values which the Corps is charged with protecting are threatened by climate change. Sea level rise could dislocate millions of families and cause hundreds of billions of dollars in damages. Extreme weather like Superstorm Sandy can destroy coastlines. Droughts can make even the mighty Mississippi impassable. And according to the world's best climate scientists, all of these impacts are caused or exacerbated by climate change. Do you agree with this?
Yes, I do.
There are many causes of climate change, but experts tell us that the single biggest source of the emissions causing climate change is China, specifically burning coal in China. The governors of Oregon and Washington and many others have said that exporting coal to China could continue China's dependence of coal and worsen climate change. They've asked you to examine this issue, yet you're telling us you won't do this. My question to you is, how can you conclude that exporting coal to China does not contribute to climate change if you even refuse to look at this issue?
I would say that the Corps' responsibilities and authorities with respect to our civil works program are dramatically different from the regulatory framework that governs our work within the framework that we're looking at these proposals. And primarily the proposals that we look at within our regulatory program are for non-federal activities. And within that context, these issues are not part of this core scope of analysis, the burning of the coal in Asia. Although very important aspects to look at, they're not part of our framework. They're not within our scope of analysis.
Well,
and they're too far attenuated to be considered indirect effects of
Well, I think you should reconsider your position. There's no bigger threat to navigable waters than climate change. Scientists tell us that those impacts will include sea level rise, more intense storms, increased flooding. Those impacts will all adversely affect navigable waters. It's the responsibility of the Corps of Engineers to protect the nation's navigable waters. The Corps cannot meet its responsibility by ignoring these climate impacts. Before billions of dollars are spent building new coal export facilities, we need to understand the impacts of those exports, including the climate impacts of burning all of that coal. I just think that makes common sense, so I would urge you to reconsider the position in light of the impact that I think is so important to the core goal of the Corps of Engineers. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back. It's time to recognize the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Scalise, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank our panel for their testimony. And when I gave my opening, I talked a little bit about the export facility at Cheniere. Their investment alone represents about $10 billion. Again, private money being used to build this export facility so that we can create more jobs, not only become energy independent at home, but also reduce our trade balance by exporting to other countries as well. There are, in addition to Cheniere, there are, I think, 18 pending applications to build additional export facilities that are moving slowly through the process. I want to ask you, Mr. Smith, because in your testimony you talked about the economic impact on LNG exports. If you can expand on that, in general, what are your thoughts on what LNG exports and expanding this would mean to our nation's economy first, if I could ask you that?
Well, thank you, Congressman, for the question. So when we look at our job in terms of evaluating public interest, again, the standard that's set in the statute is that there's a rebuttable presumption that exports are in the public interest. And it requires us to do a public interest determination for all of the applications that we're considering. So as part of that, we consider a very wide range of factors when we're evaluating each export. We look at economic growth, we look at jobs, we look at balance of trade, we look at prices, we look at impact on American businesses and families, we look at impact on manufacturing sector, on users of natural gas, we look at environmental impacts. So there's a very wide range of standards that we use. Part of that study, or part of that evaluation, we went out and requested a detailed economic study that was done in 2 parts. The first by our own EIA within the Department of Energy, and the second by a third-party consultant. The overall result of that study, which was done for the department and entered into the public docket for public review, was that at various levels we found that LNG exports would be beneficial for the U.S. economy. The study reported.
Did you quantify jobs, economic impact?
Yeah, the study looked at jobs. It looked at economic.
How many
impact,
jobs did it
GDP.
conclude?
I don't have a number of jobs, and certainly there was. If you look at different sectors, LNG exports would have a different impact for certain sectors than other sectors. But overall, net, we saw that there would be a positive economic impact for the U.S. economy, and a fairly flat impact on jobs overall.
So when you work in the Department of Energy and you have a study you commission that shows that LNG exports would have an overall positive impact on our economy, and then you see that there are other agencies within the federal government that in various ways are trying to come and impede the production of natural gas in America, which, of course, if you don't produce it in America, then you can't export it. What do y'all do, if anything, to work with these other agencies that are trying to get in the way of what states are doing very successfully to regulate hydraulic fracturing, to give them this data, to make it clear to them that, if you're spending your time and resources that these agencies complain with sequestration and spending limitations, they complain that they don't have enough money, yet they're spending some of those vital resources to try to do things that would be counter to our own nation's economy, that would hurt these jobs that you're talking about, that you tout. Do y'all share this with these other agencies as they're going off on these kind of separate tangents?
Well, we work very closely with all the agencies here within the federal government, because we have one mission, one shared mission, which is to ensure that we prudently develop what's a very important resource, our natural resources here in the United States, particularly natural gas, and also ensure that we do so with a minimal impact on the environment. The most important thing that the Department of Energy is doing right now in terms of prudent development is to take concerns seriously, bring good objective science to quantifying the concerns that people who live close to where these wells are being drilled have, to help demonstrate that we take the concerns seriously and that the regulations that are in place are effectively mitigating those risks which we have scientifically quantified.
And so, our states do that already, and so that you don't have a need to duplicate things that are already being done successfully. Our states actually do. Each state regulates hydraulic fracturing and horizontal drilling, and they do it very well. And so as you have these concerns, as each state has their concerns, right. I think somebody in Shreveport, Louisiana, where they've got the Haynesville shale play, they feel much more comfortable that if there's any kind of concern, they could pick up the phone and call their state representative or call their state Department of Natural Resources and get those problems addressed, rather than calling some bureaucrat that they can't identify, maybe can't even get in touch with it in Washington, D.C. So I appreciate if you share this information with other agencies, know that some of the things they're doing run counter to the very things you showed in your report about jobs. So I appreciate that. Yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. This time recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. McNerney, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Moyer, I believe this is the first public acknowledgement that the Corps is not going to do regional EIRs. Is that correct? This is the first time that that's been publicly acknowledged by the Corps?
That we're not doing a regional or an area-wide?
Right.
Yes.
Well, I thank you for making that statement. However, it seems to me that the combined effect on traffic and noise pollution, road coal dust, and all these other things would have a regional impact. How did the Corps come to that decision that a regional or area-wide impact was not appropriate?
By doing a very careful review of our existing regulations and pertinent case law, it's very clear that these facilities are widely separated. They're not in the same watershed. They have very different proposed impacts when you look at each individual facility. And they're not connected actions. Each facility is not dependent on another facility to go forward. And when you look at that in the context of the existing framework of regulations, those are the factors that lead you to do an area-wide, and none of those factors.
So you think that doing the specific EIRs for each individual facility will be sufficient to capture those issues and protect the local population?
I do, and each district is in the process of doing a specific NEPA evaluation. The two in Seattle district are undergoing environmental impact statements. The project in the Portland district, the Coyote Island terminal, is currently undergoing the process of an environmental assessment to determine if they need to do an EIS or not.
Does the governors of the two states involved agree that that's the appropriate approach?
They're involved in the process in the normal way that we engage in those coordination attempts. Now, the state is a cooperating agency and is actually a co-lead agency on the two projects in Washington State. So that is a federal, state, and actually the counties where the projects are located in Washington State are also participating as co-lead agencies on the Washington State projects.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Wright, would you reiterate how the FERC and the DOE jurisdictions on LNG break down?
Basically, excuse me, the Department of Energy is in charge of approving the import or the export of the commodity, the natural gas, the movement itself. FERC is in charge of approving the facilities necessary to effect that movement, the import or the export of the natural gas.
And the operations of the facilities?
Yes.
Is there much collaboration between the two agencies?
Well, we do talk, yes. I mean, we do have different procedures, and we don't necessarily participate in each other's procedures, but we're aware of what's going on at each other's agencies.
Do you all feel this is a controversial issue, LNG exports?
From my perspective as an environmental and safety regulator, it is a controversial issue in that some people do not like infrastructure. They do not like the impact on the environment. Others go further and worry about the effects on the economy, but we're not charged with looking at the effects, the socioeconomic impact.
So how much gas do you expect will escape from these LNG terminals?
I don't have a number for that, sir.
That would be, I heard zero over there. I don't hardly believe that. I'd like to see that. I mean, that's, natural gas is a strong greenhouse gas, much stronger than carbon dioxide, although it doesn't persist in the environment as long. But in the short term, we need to worry about that. Are you in charge of regulations to determine the technical quality of the materials that go into building an LNG terminal?
We do an engineering review of what is proposed and what will be constructed there, and look for the most efficient and safest way to build LNG terminal.
So what can you do then to reduce road gas from escaping from LNG terminals?
Well,
what will you do?
Well, not being an engineer myself, my engineers would meet with the project proponent. They would talk over, and they do this in technical conferences, talk over what valving, what piping they're going to use, and whether it's the most, the current, the state of the art, if you will. And that would be the one way to protect against fugitive emissions, is using the most relevant, the most current facilities and construction materials possible.
So, I mean, coming from an engineering background, thank you for indulging me, Mr. Chairman, a little bit. Field testing, test data, some way of assuring, rather than just saying it's the newest equipment, would be in order. And I'll yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. At this time, I recognize the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Shimkus. 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. From my friend from California, we do have LNG facilities today, and they've been operating for decades, some of them. And I just find it hard to believe that they would create a facility that would leak gas, a commodity they want to sell on the market. We had talked before about, I usually bring a poster, I haven't done it this Congress, of coal miners who lost their jobs in the 92 Clean Air Act. And so sometimes I get questions, well, where is it? Well, this is a great debate about bringing a new poster about coal mining jobs that are available in Southern Illinois because of the exporting of coal. So I have a Illinois-based supply-side story. Well, that's not the first one I want to use. I want to use the Ernst & Young analysis, and it says that 15%, which is 5.5 million short tons, were exported abroad. This is just in Illinois, and accounted for 15% of the total 5,868 coal mining jobs in just my state alone. The total estimate direct, indirect, and reduced contribution related to exports in 2011 is 4,190 jobs, 281 million of labor income, and 524 million of gross value added. So we're poised as a country to really be in a great position to turn over my past decade of being here. It's always we're sending our money to the Middle East because they have the energy. Now we can say people are going to be buying our energy. They're going to be sending their money to us, which will help across the board in our balance of payments, on trade, on our revenues to our country, providing the services, especially on the sequestration. This is just a tremendous win-win if we get it right. If we get through the regulatory hurdles and we get the export facilities, whether it's for LNG terminals or whether it's for coal, and we start exporting this stuff to folks who want to purchase it. The other, so here's another one. This is one I've held up before. Illinois Basin supply side story. Illinois Basin producers are positioning themselves to nearly double production over the next 10 years. Now, for the climate change folks, that's scary. I mean, for people in southern Illinois who want jobs, that's very, very exciting. But the caution is that these expansions are market dependent. So, you know, the fight about LNG terminals or whether the fight is on coal terminals, it's a climate debate to try to destroy the market so that we don't have the market to expand our selling of the fossil fuel bounty that we have in our great land. That's what this debate's about, and everyone knows it. And so that's why we need to move forward for jobs and lower cost energy and the like. Illinois just moved yesterday. The governor signed the fracking bill. We think it'll be exploited greatly in southern Illinois, and crude oil will be flowing again like it did during World War II, and we'll need, again, markets. So, Mr. Chairman, I would suggest that we have one more. You know, this is on exports of LNG and coal. I think there may be a time, based upon the demand of liquid transportation fuels right now and our supply and our renewables, that we might be able to export refined product across the world to those in need, because the world market's going to go up about 1% at a minimum. So we may want to follow this up with another opportunity for jobs. So in my last minute, let me turn to Ms. Moyer, because we're talking about kind of the hurdles that we're facing. What's the average time frame for the Corps to complete an environmental impact statement for the purpose of a marine terminal?
I don't have the time.
We don't have an average time frame?
I don't. I can get that information. We can get you some information on that.
What can the draft environmental impact statement for the Gateway Pacific Terminal project be expected?
They just finished scoping, and at the end of this month they're going to release the scoping report, so that will outline what issues and effects they're going to be considering in that draft document. So from there, then they will draft the EIS. So I don't have the final timeline for that, but they're moving forward with that process.
And when do you expect the draft EIS for the Millennium Bulk Terminal project?
They're initiating scoping this summer, and as I mentioned previously, they're doing a joint process with the state and the county. So it's the Corps, the state, and the county, and I think that although it makes things go a little bit more slowly than if the Corps was doing it by itself, moving together, forward together, will ultimately get us all to the same.
You're hoping that a partnership will help you get to the finish line faster than a supposed fight that may occur if you're not.
Right, right.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's time has expired. At this time, I recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. But just aside, I'm glad to hear my colleague from Illinois is going to be producing oil, because we're good friends, but we do have differences coming from Texas and from Illinois on ethanol. But I'm hoping you're going to produce a lot more oil than you do ethanol. So, but again, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding the hearing. Thank our witnesses. Mrs. Smith, I want to thank you, because I enjoyed meeting with you last week, and I hope you don't mind. I'll repeat some of my questions for the record. And based on your remarks recently at the Senate Energy hearing, it's been suggested the remaining applications may be considered at a one project every 2 months pace. Is that true?
What we are able to say is two things. First, we are looking at these on a case-by-case basis, so it's going to vary between projects. Yeah. But if you look at our performance for the Freeport application, between closing of the public comment and the release of the application was just over 2 months.
Okay. You mentioned also that further additional information becomes available at the end of 2003, including the EIA's annual Energy Outlook Report. The Department will assess the impact of any market developments on subsequent public interest determinations. Are you suggesting that you plan to take another pause at the end of the year? If so, aren't you concerned that it will give certain companies a competitive advantage?
Well, thanks for the question, Congressman. What we're going to do is ensure that we're always using the most appropriate information that's available. So as market conditions change or as new information becomes available, we're going to be constantly reassessing these applications on a case-by-case basis.
Okay. This question is for both you and Mr. Wright. When it comes to your statutory responsibility in regards to LNG exports and imports, are there any issues or limitations within the Natural Gas Act that you'd like to see changed in order to do your job more expeditiously and effectively? Either FERC, and I know it's a three-step process. That's why Corps is here, but mainly FERC and DOE.
Thanks for the question. I'd state that our job as a member of the executive branch is to ensure that we are executing the law as written, both the letter and the spirit of the law. So if Congress should change the law, we'll certainly be executing the spirit of that law as changed.
Okay, but you don't have any suggestions on improvements in the law?
I would not take it upon myself to make suggestions to this body about what they should change.
Mr. Smith or Mr. Wright?
As per the Energy Policy Act of 2005, FERC was explicitly named the lead agency for processing LNG cases as well as pipelines. And within that context, we set the schedule, and we set the schedule not only for ourselves but for other agencies. So I would agree with Mr. Smith. We have a good deal of authority that we need. If this body believes we need more, we'll welcome it.
Okay. Mr. Wright, in conducting the environmental reviews, do you find that other agencies are responding in a timely manner?
In most cases, yes. Agencies do. Some agencies do have statutory considerations that that prevent them from adhering to our usual our schedule that we put out. That was acknowledged in the Energy Policy Act of 2005, but in general, the agencies do a very good job.
Okay. Ms. Smith, you mentioned that Section 3A of the Natural Gas Act creates a rebuttable presumption that a proposed export of natural gas is in the public interest. Why do you choose then to conduct a full public interest review?
Well, I mean, our interpretation of that law simply states that it is incumbent on those who would expose exports to demonstrate that approving a particular export application would not be consistent with the public interest, which means that we have to take those things into consideration. The law states that we have to consider the public interest, and that's what we do through our processes.
Okay. Mr. Smith and Mr. Cooper on the second panel argues that the case-by-case order of applicants that you plan to review violates the Administrative Procedures Act because that approach was never offered up for a notice and comment period, and how do you respond to that?
Well, you know, we have an obligation to make sure that we do consider each of these applications. We have to have some sort of sequence for doing that. So we've not put in place anything that would state that there is a rule or something unique that applicants have to do before they will be considered. But in doing our work with the finite resources that we have to have some sort of process for getting through the queue of applicants, and we wanted that to be open and transparent and fair.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I know I'm almost out of time, but coming from Texas, it seems like every port from Little Sabine River to the Rio Grande is going to get in line. So hopefully we can keep that production going in South Texas, make sure we can do that, use it, and export what we can't use. Thank you.
Chair, at this time, recognize the gentleman from Nebraska, Mr. Terry, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and it's only appropriate that I ask questions after Mr. Green from Texas, because it was 2005 that he and I teamed up to expedite the process to import liquid natural gas, as we felt there was a shortage of natural gas to meet our then current needs. That no longer exists today, and now we're talking about perhaps those same facilities that were being permitted to export or import liquid natural gas can now turn around and be exporters ourselves of natural gas. So I was interested, I think it was Mr. Wright, that there was a conversation regarding taking into account any price impacts on consumers. Was that you that answered that question?
No, it was not.
Was that you, Mr. Smith? Sorry, Mr. Smith. And so, in regard, what was your finding on any impact on prices?
So we commissioned a study that was delivered to the Department of Energy, and that study found that in some cases that there could be some price impacts in terms of creating additional demand.
Can you be more specific?
Well, there are lots of cases, so we looked at a number of cases. So we found in the base case, it's actually very difficult for LNG to compete in global markets, and so there would be zero or no impact on prices. We ran other cases that looked at a limited supply of LNG globally. We looked at other cases that looked at increased demand for LNG globally, and we looked at some cases that combine some of those. But in different scenarios, we know that LNG is at least historically has been a fairly volatile commodity in terms of price. But we found that the overall impact on the economy, the results of the study said would be positive.
Is our current supply of natural gas that's readily available, recoverable, is it meeting our current needs of natural gas in the United States?
I would say yes.
In fact, there's an argument that we have an oversupply of of natural gas currently.
Right.
So there's actually opportunities to increase demand. Is that correct?
I think right now certainly you see some surplus of natural gas in lots of basins. In fact, you see some areas in which companies are flaring natural gas. So certainly you could unambiguously state that in many parts of the country you see some surpluses of natural gas.
Thank you. Mr. Wright, a question for you based off of the reason why we needed to streamline permitting of import facilities in the United States so we could take more natural gas, the amendment that Gene Green and I had. So currently now for exporting, what role does state and county and local agencies play in connection with siting of any LNG facilities under Section 7 of the Nat Gas Act?
Well, actually, under Section 3 of the Natural Gas Act.
Or Section 3.
Yeah, states are invited to participate in the process, and if they wish to assign an agency to comment upon it, they are to do so within 30 days of the filing of the application. So their involvement begins early on in the process.
And counties and localities have the same ability to provide you information?
Oh, certainly. Anyone has the ability to provide information to us.
But they don't have the ability to stop a project now, other than if you take into account their comments.
Well, that's part of what the environmental process is, the NEPA process.
Yeah. Now, what is the position of your office on whether the state has authority under the Coastal Zone Management Act to allow a county official to effectively veto a Section 7 natural gas pipeline application by withholding a local permit?
Well, that has actually happened. Thinking back, it was a proposal to bring a pipeline across Long Island Sound some years ago, and that was effectively vetoed by the federally delegated authority to the state.
So that could happen again?
Yes, it could.
All right. And last, and this is to both Mr. Smith and Mr. Wright and Ms. Meyer, have you heard of have any lawsuits been filed against your agencies by environmental groups regarding permitting LNG export facilities? Mr. Smith?
We would certainly expect all of the actions of the department to be scrutinized and contested. And in fact, we've had some legal issues that we're currently litigating. So yes.
All right.
We've had hearings filed in the Sabine Pass, the one action we did take. I do not believe we were taken to court over that, though.
All right.
And I'm not aware of any, but I can.
Thank you.
Gentleman's time's expired. This time recognize the gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Castor, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This hearing presents us with an issue that America must confront. With everything science is telling us about climate change and carbon pollution, should our country be promoting and increasing exports of coal? I tend to agree with the ranking member, Mr. Waxman, when he says there is a difference between coal exports and natural gas. For coal is the single largest contributor to climate change and global warming. And the resulting impacts, looking out at the years ahead, are quite dire for our country and all across the globe. It's going to impact our national security, as our military leaders have said. It's a great risk to coastal areas like my home state of Florida, health issues. So can America, on the one hand, provide any global leadership to fight climate change, and then on the other hand promote and increase exports of coal? And Ms. Moyer, I know you, in your previous testimony here today, you said that examination of the broader climate change impacts really are not within the framework of the Army Corps, but you did acknowledge that climate change is very serious. So shouldn't some agency consider the larger impacts of expanding coal exports on climate change?
And certainly, I think that climate change is a huge issue that's facing us all. That's my personal opinion. And what was in my testimony and what I'll reflect on again is that NEPA and the Corps zone regulations direct that the Corps consider whether the Corps' permit action is part of a larger action or whether it's whether we have a limited handle on what's being proposed. And if it's part of a larger project, we have to decide what aspects outside of our jurisdiction do we have control and responsibility for, and therefore expand our scope of analysis. And in the context of these proposed terminals, we've looked at the context and we've determined that we don't control coal mining. We don't control shipping by rail or shipping on the
a number of
high seas.
elected officials and community leaders, environmental groups, public health organizations have raised concerns about the potential impacts of building and operating a new coal export terminals in Washington State and Oregon. The impact of the coal export terminals on water quality in the region's fisheries are one important concern. In a letter to the Army Corps, the Puget Sound Partnership, a state agency established to lead efforts to protect and restore Puget Sound, outlined several concerns with the proposed Gateway Pacific Terminal near Cherry Point, Washington. The partnership raised ocean acidification as a major concern. Ocean acidification is caused by oceans rapidly absorbing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and the state of Washington has launched a major initiative to address the impacts since it harms the state's shellfish populations and commercial fisheries. How will the Army Corps examine the impact of the proposed coal export terminals on ocean acidification in the Pacific Northwest?
And it's my understanding that ocean acidification is another resulting or another result from climate change. So it leads back to.
But it's regional. You said some impacts are too attenuated for the Corps, but that's a regional impact or a very localized impact.
Well, ocean acidification, it's the results. It's what's in those letters is tied back to the local impacts from overall ocean acidification. And I'm not at all discounting that there are those concerns from.
All right, let me ask another specific question. The Washington State Department of Fish and Wildlife suggested the Corps evaluate potential impact of coal dust generated by the Gateway Terminal, which would affect water quality in nearby streams and wetlands. Others have raised broader concerns about the water quality impacts along the rail and barge routes. How will the Army Corps study the impacts of coal dust from the proposed coal export terminals.
And as I mentioned in my testimony, the Corps is going to look at those effects that are within its scope of analysis, so the ones that are occurring within the facility itself and those areas in which we've
What
expanded.
about the health of the Columbia River and other important salmon habitat?
Those aspects of it that are within our control and responsibility certainly will be considered. Both all of the effects, direct, indirect, and cumulative, will be considered. But those areas that are outside of our scope of analysis will not be considered.
Thank you very much.
Gentlelady yields back. This time recognize the gentleman from Louisiana, Dr. Cassidy, for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Mr. Wright, the Sabine Pass liquefaction project in Cameron Parish took 441 days. And it may, I don't know if this is going to be Mr. Wright or Mr. Smith. And I think, Mr. Smith, you mentioned that it was only 2 months between the closing of the application process to approval, so 60 days. So clearly there's 381 days in which the process took the time to get done. So what bottlenecks are coming up that are prolonging this process?
So thank you for the question. So we certainly understand the sense of urgency around these regulatory processes, and we're endeavoring to move these forward as expeditiously as possible in all cases. So in the timeline that you just mentioned, after the Sabine Pass order was finished, we stated in the Sabine Pass order that we did have to consider the cumulative impact of that order and any subsequent orders when we're looking at additional authorizations. This is a very important and complex public interest determination that has to look at domestic and global impacts, domestic markets, global markets, impacts on consumers, American businesses and families, jobs, et cetera. It's not a trivial point, and we did have,
so was there a bottleneck per se, or was it just that the complexity of the issue was such that it just takes that long?
I think it was a tremendously complex and important issue. And
now, since a lot of those issues are generic, presumably subsequent approvals will not take as long?
I would agree. One of the reasons that we pointed out that the period between the end of the comment period and the actual issuing of the order was something, just north of 2 months, was to state that the cumulative impact study, which was a complex study, is not something that we see that we're going to have to replicate between each one of these orders.
Now, just because I know this is how the game works, there may be an agency that sits on it and doesn't process it. Is there any way to, one, identify agencies which perhaps were not as expeditious as they could be, and two, if there was such an agency, it doesn't have to be named, is there any way to put the Bunsen burner underneath them to get them to actually get it moving?
Our job is very specific. And very explicit. It's to work together to move as expeditiously as possible to get good public interest determination.
That's not really answering my question.
Well, I mean, Congressman, I think it does address the issue. I mean, we are currently.
So there's never an agency that seems to be a little dilatory in terms of how quickly they respond?
Well, in this case, we've got two primary agencies that have jurisdiction. We control the authorization to export the molecule. FERC controls the authorization to build the terminal, and we are working together very closely to make sure that we're getting this work done.
Okay. Mr. Wright, would you add anything to what has been said?
What I would say, and I said earlier this morning, a lot of our problems or difficulties in processing do stem from the applicant. We encourage, or by statute, they're supposed to stay in the pre-filing period for at least 6 months. Some companies are very eager to get out of the pre-filing, thinking that going to the application mode would hasten the processing. It does not. Pre-filing is a very free-flowing information flow period. You go to a formal application, our ex parte rules take over. Things have to be done much more in writing and on the record. That said, I believe Cheniere would have been processed much sooner. They did not complete their air modeling analysis during the pre-filing. So substantial, they jumped right to the formal application. Therefore, substantial information was required after their certificate filing was made.
Gotcha. Is there any limitation or time frame in which individuals or organizations can file claims in court to request a rehearing of the commission orders?
30 days after the commission issues its order. Rehearings are due.
So there is a definite kind of defined time frame, cannot exceed?
Yes, sir.
Great. Mr. Smith, any comments? You looked like you were looking off in space pensively.
I had no additional comments.
Gotcha. Okay. I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Cassidy. At this time, I recognize the gentleman from West Virginia, Mr. McKinley, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a series of things I'd like you to react to on it. The Energy Policy Research Foundation has said that neither net world coal combustion nor the greenhouse gas emissions will change substantially as a result of an expansion of our coal exports. Interesting statement. That was one. The other comes from McClellan, who used to be chairman of the National Research Council Committee on Toxicology. He was past chairman of the EPA's Clean Air Scientific Advisory Committee, has said, the coal continues to play an important role in meeting the energy needs around the world. With steady improvements made in its transport and use, coal has been transported through the Northwest by rail for decades, and there has never been any evidence of harm associated with this rail transport. Could any of you respond to those two comments?
Well, I can give a general response. I mean, we don't have oversight over coal exports, but I'd certainly say two things. First, we do have significant concerns about climate change, and we think that there are specific things that we need to do to be reducing greenhouse gas emissions into the environment. The second is that we are.
If I could, on climate change, if you could you tell me what's your end game? If we're 400 parts per million of CO2, and where do you want it to stop it?
Yeah.
At 400, or do you want it back to 250, or where are we trying to go?
Well, I cannot give you a specific answer to that question because it's not simply something that's not under my jurisdiction. But I can say that in terms of the research and development we're doing for coal, we are making a historic investment to ensure that coal is part of the clean energy economy of the future, that we are making steps to ensure that we're able to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from coal-fired power plants, that we are creating the technologies so that we can sequester it in a way that's safe and environmentally sustainable, and that we're able to take advantage of this very important domestic energy resource. So that there are technological research and development solutions to the challenges that we see of making sure that all of our energy resources remain relevant and contributory.
All right. Well, okay, so we didn't really answer either of those two questions, but go back. If we don't export coal, do we really think the other nations are going to not find coal someplace else?
Again, Congressman.
My question, are we trying to take ourselves out of the market and all the jobs that are related to it, from transportation to mining it and all the support facilities? I'm trying to understand, because I think the congressman from Illinois was right. That this isn't a fight about exports. This is a fight about coal. The war on coal continues here in Washington. So I'm trying to really grasp where we're going, because they're going to find coal someplace else, or they're going to find natural gas, LNG, from someone else, are they not?
Well, Ms.
Are they not? Are they not going to? If we don't sell it to them, will they not find it someplace else?
Well, one can observe that there is lots and lots of coal that's being burned in China and India. There are lots of plants that are going up. There's lots of activity there. There are things that we are doing that are very proactive in terms of taking.
But are they going to? So we're just taking ourselves out of the market if we were allow this to either be postponed, delayed, or terminated. Isn't that right?
I can't speak to exports. Again, Ms. Moyer could speak to exports.
Could you please add into this? Because I'm curious about for all the jobs that are associated with it in our industry. And coming from West Virginia, 50% of the export of coal comes from West Virginia. And so I take it very personally when someone says we potentially could ban the exporting of coal or natural gas.
And certainly,
could you get closer to your mic, please? Just
sure.
Thank you.
And certainly, knowing that you're from West Virginia, you're certainly most likely very familiar with the fact that the Corps of Engineers doesn't regulate or have the responsibility for regulating the development of coal resources.
I understand, but but you've got the terminals. and they're threatened, but yet we have testimony from people. We've got mayors from all over the Northwest who say they support this.
And what I explained in my testimony is that the Corps of Engineers has very limited authority in these shipping facilities, where you have a limited scope of analysis. We are not looking at a lot of these attenuated effects. We're sticking to the footprint of the project itself and the associated indirect effects. So
Hey, I'm sorry, I've run out of my time. I'm sorry. Maybe we can chat more about the three of you. See,
Gentleman's time has expired.
Thank you very much.
This time I recognize the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Griffith, for 5 minutes.
I kind of feel like we're in tag team, and McKinley just tagged me. Let's pick it up where we left off. Virginia has, most of them are in my district, 9,000 plus workers who deal with coal. And one of my concerns is, as I was listening to some of the other questions, that you would think that some of the folks, want to dictate to the rest of the world everything that happens. And I think we've learned a long time ago that while the United States has huge influence, we can't dictate to other countries of the world. And so I do feel your pain, Ms. Moyer, in trying to, you're trying to do your job within the parameters that you're given, but you can't make decisions because it is complex as to what happens and whether or not coal production in the United States for export would really change the amount of coal being burned, because you would not disagree with me if I were to tell you that over the last several years, the Australians, the Indonesians, the Indians, the Russians, the Chinese, some of the southern African countries have all increased their coal production, and I would submit in part because there's some hesitancy to use American coal for fear that the American coal resources will be shut down. But you wouldn't disagree with me if I indicated that there were numerous nations around the world that have increased their coal production and their coal usage, would you?
I don't know what they've done. I'm not familiar with
And
those.
that's why you can't make a decision when you're trying to decide whether or not a new facility should be opened up. You can't look at all of that. You have to decide what the impact is on building that facility and do what your job is in the parameters that are given to you by the law on that facility, not looking at the worldwide impact of what might or might not happen as we move forward. Isn't that correct?
Correct.
And Mr. Smith, I'm glad to hear that you all are looking at coal and things that we can do. I've been very excited about the work at Ohio State, where they have come up with a process that has worked in the small scale to do a chemical looping that has virtually no pollutant, a little bit, I think 1% of the carbon dioxide currently produced, but they get the energy out of the coal without having any of the NOx, the SOx, the mercury, but about only 1% of what's currently produced on carbon dioxide. And I would wonder if you could tell me what you know about that project, and as they move forward on the project in Alabama, how much assistance you all are going to give them in moving that project onto the fast track. Because if that works, not only can we export American coal, but we can export technology that makes it so that Mr. Waxman and I can agree that it's good to have jobs and we don't have global warming in the process.
Well,
tell me what you're doing.
Thank you, Congressman, for that question. So over the course of the last several years, we've made a historic $6 billion investment in technologies to reduce the cost to capture CO2 out of coal-fired power plants and to demonstrate that we can successfully and sustainably store CO2 either in saline aquifers or in depleted oil fields for enhanced oil recovery. That's a critically important goal to ensure that we're using all of our domestic resources as part of our all-of-the-above strategy.
Well, what, if I might, because obviously we all have limited time, but if this technology that Ohio State University has developed and has been working on, if that works, that answers all those other questions. I mean, we don't have to worry as much about carbon sequestration because there isn't going to be very much carbon output. You end up with basically a process that's all housed within, the box, and of course the bigger the box, we have to see how it works. And so I would strongly encourage that the Department of Energy take a very serious look at that and see if what we can do to fast track that project to see if it works, because I think it has the same potential to have us sitting here in 5 years going, we thought we weren't going to be able to do this, and shazam, it happened. That we're now saying about natural gas, because just a couple of years ago they were saying we were going to have to import And now we're talking about what we can do to expedite exports. And I would note on that, in that regard, hoping that you all are looking at the impact of jobs if we do approve LNG for export. But some people have said, well, that would make the prices go up. We're still waiting in Virginia for the approval to do offshore drilling. We think we have a lot of natural gas. We think we might have some oil, but we think we've got a lot of natural gas out there. If we're able to export, not only do we create jobs in the United States, but I don't think there's any impact to any significant impact to the price, because that will just spur more exploration in the United States for more natural gas. We ought to use our resources to create jobs. Wouldn't you agree?
We're enthusiastic about chemical looping and all the projects you mentioned, and we're working together on those on some of those goals.
Anything you can help us to do to get approval for offshore drilling in Virginia would be fantastic. Thank you. I see my time is up, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. This time recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. Tonko, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It appears DOE's consideration of public interest is somewhat limited, in part due to the declarations in statute that exports of LNG to countries we have a trade agreement with are consistent with the public interest. I want to explore the concept a bit more. Unlike metal, paper, cloth, or agricultural commodities, once natural gas is exported and used, that's it. The fossil reserves of it cannot be regenerated, and it cannot be reclaimed through recycling. So, if we could, Mr. Smith, how does DOE account for this in its determination of public interest?
Well, the statute creates two different separate categories. There's a category for countries with which the United States have a free trade agreement, and there is a separate category for those countries with which the United States does not have a free trade agreement. So by statute, we don't have discretion over exports to those countries. So following the letter and the spirit of the law, those applications are approved without delay or modification or further consideration by the Department. So when we talk about public interest determinations and all the work that we're doing, studies, evaluations, those apply to those countries with which the United States does not have a free trade agreement.
Okay, thank you. And the determination of the price that will benefit domestic manufacturing without providing a distinctive or a disincentive, to continue extraction is a difficult task. How does DOE consider each application for export in a national context?
Right. So the Department certainly doesn't set prices or determine business models. So the way that we have to look at that is look at our global dynamic equilibrium models that would help us consider what would be the impact on the domestic prices to various scenarios for export to other countries. So these are studies, they're estimates, they're based on the best available data that we have in place, and that's the methodology that we use to try to estimate what might be the impact of approving applications.
Is the number of facilities you would approve contingent on our oversupply and the number of existing facilities?
Well, certainly as we look at each facility, we're going to have to consider the cumulative impact of facilities that we've already approved. So part of that is understanding, well, what is the supply and demand balance in the United States? What do we think about the size of the resources that are available and our ability to ensure that we can prudently and safely develop those resources? So those are all things that go into the modeling and the consideration when we're making these public interest determinations.
Mm-hmm. And how does the public interest test apply to the reduction of domestic reserves of an essential fuel and feedstock that cannot be easily replaced?
I'm sorry, I'm not sure I understood the question. How does the
Right. How does the public interest test apply to the reduction of domestic reserves of an essential fuel and feedstock that cannot be easily replaced?
So we do believe that we've got a vast supply of natural gas in the United States, 100 years of supply, 800 trillion cubic feet of natural gas within the Marcellus Shale alone. So we think this is a large resource that will be attractive if we can produce it in a way that's safe and environmentally sustainable. So we have to consider the size of the resource, and that's part of the public interest determination that we make for each of these applications.
And the extraction of fossil fuels obviously has benefits, both private and public, but it also has costs, especially in the communities where this activity is occurring. If exporting LNG stimulates additional extraction and the gas is not being used as a fuel or feedstock here, how are the costs to communities where extraction takes place accounted for in your determination of public interest?
Well, thank you for that question. And certainly we have a keen understanding and awareness that the most important factor in prudent development and effective use of the resource is to ensure that the people who live and work close to where the wells are being drilled are comfortable with the processes, that we've scientifically quantified the risks, and that we're demonstrating that the regulations are mitigating those risks. So that's the core part of the research and development that we do within my office in terms of environmental sustainability and safety of domestic oil and gas production. So we consider that in our public interest determination, but we're also doing that in real time in terms of real research and development that's helping us to ensure that those resources develop safely.
Okay. Thank you very much. I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Gentleman yields back. This time recognize the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Latta, for 5 minutes.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that. And also I want to thank our witnesses today. Appreciate your testimony. You know, there's kind of a common theme that's kind of gone through a lot of the questioning is a lot on the timeline for the applications to go through. And if I could just maybe follow up on a couple of these, if I may. Ms. Moyer, one of the things when you're looking at these applications, how often do you have third-party litigants that are going to be filing lawsuits? Do you have any idea, like in the current cases out west, how many third-party litigants you have?
As far as I know, we don't have anybody that has sued us yet because we haven't taken an agency action.
Okay. If I could turn then to Mr. Smith, I think that, I'm sorry, Mr. Wright, I believe that Mr. Barton had asked a question as to, from start to finish and filing of an application, how long it takes. Did I understand it was 18 to 24 months? Was that correct, what I heard?
I was using the example of our experience with the regasification plants, the import terminals. What I tried to point out is using Sabine Pass example of about 15 months is kind of risky in that it's each one of the export terminals are presenting kind of issues of first impression. So I can't put my exact finger on a processing time for export terminals.
Okay. Well, because I'm just kind of curious, because in your testimony, when you kind of lay out the your timelines and what's happening from the pre-filing process, it says for a period of about at least 6 months, and then for the formal application that when that's been filed, and then you have right in the same paragraph the question again, if I can bring this up, is on the interveners become parties to proceedings and have the right to request a rehearing of a commission orders and seek relief of final agency actions in the U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals. When that happens, how much time is needed for that to get something out of the Court of Appeals?
Well, that would be up to the actual project proponent. If you get through our rehearing process and we find that your project is approved, if someone sues you in the Court of Appeals, you could go ahead and commence construction activities at your risk.
Okay.
Many people do that on the pipeline side.
Okay. And pardon me, and if I could turn, Mr. Smith, if I could ask you, it's kind of interesting that in your testimony you state that in the one case, I think it was the Sabine, if I got that correct, it says that in response to the notice of availability, DOE received over 188,000 initial comments and approximately 2,700 reply comments. How long did it take you all to get through all that? Any idea?
From the time that we closed that comment period to the time we issued the order, it was somewhere around 2.5 months was a period of time that we took to evaluate all the comments, write the order, and get the order published in the Federal Registry notice and out to the applicant.
Okay. In that period of time, just out of curiosity then, how many folks do you have looking at the comments, and then also how much time is spent looking at pretty much each of those comments, since you had, again, 188,000 initial comments and then again the 2,700 reply comments? Any idea how much time you can spend on each one of those?
Well, thanks for the question. Some of those comments are repetitive because some of them are letter writing campaigns. Some of them are very comprehensive, so they could be entire studies or comments that are very, very complex. So I couldn't really give you a rule of thumb for each comment because it depends.
And just also, just again, because I said that there is a common theme here of folks on the committee looking at on the time side. When you issue, it says here that on May the 17th, 2013, DOE granted the second long-term application on the Freeport. And it said in your statement, it says the order was granted after an extensive review of the application to export LNG from Freeport. How long, when you say extensive, how much time is that on that for that review?
Well, there are two things that happened between Sabine Pass and Freeport. First, we commissioned an extensive study that looked at domestic and international impacts of LNG and how those would impact American businesses, families, and consumers. So that took a period of time. That study, once completed, we want this to be an open and transparent and very visible process. So we put that study in the docket for public review. That was when various stakeholders had the opportunity to comment, and so that was the genesis of those comments that you just asked me about. And when that was completed, we took a period of time to evaluate the comments, and then we got the order written.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. My time has expired, and I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired, and that concludes the questions for this panel, except Ms. Moyer, one question I wanted to ask you. How many export facilities are under review by the Corps right now?
In the Pacific Northwest?
Yes, or no, nationwide.
I don't know. I could get back to you on that. I don't.
But in the Northwest, 3?
Just the 3.
Okay. Well, we'll stay in touch with you on that. I want to follow up on that. But thank you all very much for being with us. We appreciate your expertise and testimony. At this time, I'd like to call up the second panel. And on the second panel today, we have the Honorable Mike McGinn, who is the mayor of the city of Seattle. Okay. Yeah. We have Mr. Ross Eisenberg, who's the Vice President, Energy and Resources Policy for the National Association of Manufacturers. We have Mr. Harold Quinn, President and CEO, National Mining Association. Mr. Casey Golden, Policy Director for Climate Solutions. We have Mr. Bill Cooper, President of the Center for Liquefied Natural Gas. And we have Mr. Lucian Pularasi, President for the Energy Policy Research Foundation. So I want to thank all of you for joining us today. We look forward to your testimony on this important subject matter. And each one of you will be given 5 minutes for an opening statement, and then I'm sure that there will be some questions from members as they come back in. So thank you for joining us, and Mr. McGinn, we'll call on you for your opening statement to begin with, and each one of you will be given 5 minutes. And as I said earlier, there is a little box that, if it's working, is it working? If it's working, a red light will come on. But we look forward to your testimony. Mr. McGinn, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Upton. It's a
I'm
real
sorry, I
honor.
should say Mayor McGinn.
That's anything works. Chairman, thank you for the invitation to testify. It's a real honor to be here. A long time ago, when my hair wasn't gray and my beard was red, I worked for Congressman Jim Weaver of Oregon over there in the Longworth office building. And Northwest politics often involve energy. Congressman Weaver was deeply involved in championing conservation as opposed to new nuclear power plants at that time. And conservation was indeed the wiser choice. The Woofs nuclear power plants, which were endorsed by Congress, ended up defaulting on billions of dollars on municipal bonds. We now face another significant energy choice for the Pacific Northwest, one that could have dramatic consequences for our economic and environmental well-being. Whether 110 million tons of coal a year will be transported across the Northwest and shipped to China from Northwest ports. To put that in perspective, the carbon emissions from that coal are more than the emissions projected from the Keystone XL pipeline. So I want to describe this just a little bit. To ship this coal to China, terminals are proposed north of Bellingham, Washington, near Longview, Washington, as well as in Oregon, and British Columbia is looking at coal ports as well. To ship this coal, we'd be looking at, to get to Bellingham, we'd be looking at 18 coal trains a day, each 1.5 miles to 2 miles long, traveling from the Powder River Basin in Montana and Wyoming through Spokane in eastern Washington, down the length of the Columbia River, the border between Oregon and Washington, and then from south to north, almost to the northwest corner of the state in Bellingham, traversing multiple towns and traveling along the Puget Sound coastline. The coal trains are uncovered. They lose approximately 2% of their load on the route. The proposed coal terminal near Bellingham sits on ancestral Native American lands and is opposed by the Lummi Nation, both because it violates their burial grounds and because coal pollution in Puget Sound threatens their salmon rights, and those are treaty rights. I tell this story because the local impacts of coal trains upon communities throughout Washington are significant. Over 40 local elected officials, including tribal leaders, have joined me in a leadership alliance against coal because of the serious negative impacts on their communities. And I'd like to talk about that. Coal train traffic will clog the railroads. Coal dust and diesel exhaust from the engines pollute water and lungs. Neighborhoods along the rail line will see decreased quality of life, and it will have significant negative transportation impacts. I ask you to consider the impacts upon communities as these coal trains go through. In Seattle, in our industrial area, we have 4 at-grade crossings, and then we have 4 at-grade crossings between our downtown and our waterfront. Each of these areas are significant job-creating areas in their own right, and in order for freight traffic to reach our port, they have to go across these rail lines. We worked with a consulting firm, Parametrics, to take a close look, and we were talking about increased gate downtime up to 2 to 3 hours each day. That has economic impacts as well as public safety impacts upon our police and fire departments. Now imagine that impact on cities and towns along the entire route. These railroad lines tend to go right through the middles of towns at grade. And then let's take a look again at just the broader impacts. We've spoken about the climate impacts already. This is equivalent to all the gasoline burned by 50 million people each year. Now, unless we stop these coal terminals from being built, we will be responsible for hastening the advance of climate change here at home and around the world. Now, I've heard members of this group talk quite a bit about jobs. I just want to say we've been working really hard in Seattle to recover from the recession caused by lax oversight of our financial institutions in this country. And we're creating jobs. We're building the greenest buildings in the world. We're retrofitting buildings, and those are local jobs. You have to be in that crawl space. You have to be operating those energy control systems. We've been eliminating waste, putting the money we save to productive use. That's frugal. That's efficient. And that's reducing demand for our clean wind and water power, which means we can put that electricity to better use in our economy. In fact, we should be exporting our green building technology, not coal. In fact, we are. Our architects are building buildings in China and all over the world because they're some of the leading architects in the world. Now, I want to return to the issue of the Whoops nuclear power plants that I mentioned at the beginning. We somehow have this belief that economic growth requires ever-increasing amounts of energy use. We proved that to be wrong in the Northwest. We have had significant economic growth while reducing our energy use. We've grown by being more efficient and cleaner, enhancing our quality of life. That's the pathway to creating good jobs. The same is true with coal trains. They'll hurt us economically. We have better ways to create jobs. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor McKinn. At this time, I'd like to call on Mr. Quinn for a 5-minute opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and members of the subcommittee. Appreciate you having this hearing today. My remarks are going to focus on the economic contributions of U.S. coal exports as well as the potential for contributing more through the expansion of that capacity. As you, Mr. Chairman, know, and many members of this subcommittee are aware, coal has been the fastest growing energy source globally over the past decade. And some forecasts actually peg coal to surpass oil as a leading energy source globally within the next 2 years. As it so happens, the United States happens to have the most of what the rest of the world needs and demands, 260 billion tons of recoverable coal reserves. Put that in perspective, U.S. coal reserves equal the proven oil reserves of the entire Middle East, Russia, and the continent of Africa combined. So when it comes to energy independence, U.S. coal stands in the forefront by providing our nation the resources to build and power our economy while also supplying this energy resource to countries around the globe. fact, U.S. coal exports represent the only positive addition to the U.S. trade balance from the energy sector. Now, last year we shipped about 125 million tons of steam and metallurgical coal, double the amount we shipped 4 years ago. We shipped this coal to 76 countries around the globe through ports located in states on the East Coast, the Gulf, West Coast, and Great Lakes. The economic contributions from coal export activity are documented in a report prepared by Ernst & Young, released last month by the National Mining Association. Here are a few of the highlights. $16.6 billion was added to the GDP. Coal exports supported more than 168,000 jobs in a wide range of businesses, from coal mines, railroads, barges, trucks, cargo handling, and ports. For every million tons of coal exported, more than 1,300 jobs are added to the U.S. economy. These direct jobs created by coal exports pay on average $96,000 annually in wages and benefits, nearly 50% more than the national average. The trend of growing seaborne coal market is unmistakable. The developing world is demanding more coal to power a historic transformation from agrarian societies to commercial powers. This transformation, unprecedented in terms of scope and pace, is built upon a coal-centric infrastructure of steel, cement, and, of course, electricity. But coal is also supplying the energy and infrastructure needs of the developed world, as the cost and reliability of energy supplies becomes an increasing concern in sustaining their economic futures. With a top-of-class reserve base, workforce, and transportation infrastructure, the U.S. is well positioned to participate more fully in the growing seaborne coal trade. Now, whether we are able to participate to our full potential will turn on the building of our port capacity in terms of volume as well as location. Proposals to build coal export facilities in the Pacific Northwest are critical to connecting our western mines to the growing Asian markets. The interior basin coal fields have seen extraordinary growth in export demand, and the proposals to expand existing capacity in the Gulf will make that region even more competitive. Now, like any other major infrastructure project, major risks are posed by timing and capital costs. This is why an efficient, timely, and reliable process for reviewing permit applications are critical to ensuring that these long-term investments become a reality and bring the enormous economic benefits locally and nationally. Make no mistake, if we do not seize this opportunity, other coal exporting nations will, along with the benefits of economic growth and jobs. Major exporting nations like Canada and Australia fully understand that the fierce competition exists for these markets and that an efficient and timely regulatory process provides a competitive advantage. Last year, Canada's Prime Minister Stephen Harper announced the One Project, One Review initiative to streamline the process for permitting major infrastructure projects. Here are some of the features: deadlines for determining the type and scope of environmental assessments, binding deadlines for completing reviews and issuing decisions on permits, enhanced coordination and consolidation of responsibilities for provincial and federal agencies reviewing these projects, eliminating duplication between the provincial and federal environmental assessments. These best practices for coordination, clarity in responsibilities, and accountability with goals and timeframes are not unlike the directives in the President's Executive Order 13604 on improving performance of federal permitting on infrastructure projects. They are also reflected in the recommendations of the President's Council on Jobs and Competitiveness. So, applying these practices to reviewing coal export projects will unleash our full potential for providing more Americans opportunities for high-wage and highly skilled jobs right here in the United States. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, members.
Thank you, Mr. Quinn. And Mr. Eisenberg, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chairman Whitfield, members of the subcommittee. Thank you for having me here today to express the views of the National Association of Manufacturers and our 12,000 members, and also of the Alliance for Northwest Jobs and Exports, a broad coalition of manufacturers and agricultural, labor, civic, and other organizations that support new export projects in Oregon and Washington State, the projects we've been talking about today. The NAM was founded in 1895 on principles of free trade. At the time, the United States was in the midst of a very deep recession, and many of the nation's manufacturers saw a strong need to export their products. The NAM believes that free trade and open markets should govern in the context of energy exports, and we also oppose bans or other similar market-distorting mechanisms to energy exports. Although today's hearing has focused on both LNG and coal, my testimony today will focus primarily on coal. Manufacturing jobs support coal exports in the United States. These jobs include mining and support activities for mining, construction, railroad transportation, transport by water and truck, port operations and cargo handling, and all the manufacturing supply chain jobs that support all of these activities. Now, the economic impact of the 3 terminals here today, Morrow Pacific, Millennium Bulk Terminals, and Gateway Pacific Terminal, if allowed to move forward, would be very significant. Altogether, the 3 port expansions hold the potential to create as many as 11,730 jobs and $831.4 million in wages for the Pacific Northwest. This is an undeniably large economic boost for a region which, like the rest of the country, still continues to fight against high unemployment. These projects would trigger increased activity from a wide range of manufacturing industries, including cement, iron and steel, wood products, aluminum, transportation, and shipping, among others. The NAM and the Alliance were very pleased to hear today that the Army Corps will abide by the law and the regulations and carefully consider each coal export proposal on its merits, while appropriately bounding the scope of their analysis and their consideration of the impacts. The Corps has correctly determined that neither a programmatic nor an area-wide or regional EIS are appropriate when considering the proposed permits for the 3 projects. The facts and circumstances related to each project differ substantially, and they're not the type of connected actions that warrant any sort of combined review. We're encouraged that the Corps is committed to carrying out its duties in accordance with the law. This is a great first step toward creating thousands of manufacturing jobs in the region. Now, opponents of these projects have characterized this as a choice between the environment and the economy. It's not. These 3 infrastructure projects plan to fully comply with all the required environmental laws and regulations. The projects will thoroughly examine air quality, water quality, marine life, wetlands, human health, rail traffic, vessel safety and traffic, endangered species, and the dozens of other potential impacts of their projects required by all federal, state, and local permitting laws. They would like nothing more than to proceed through the permitting process in an orderly fashion as the law requires. The Corps appears ready to give them that opportunity. Understand, however, that what the law requires isn't necessarily what the opponents are calling for. They're asking to broaden the scope of the environmental review to such a degree that the analysis will be so long and so exhaustive that it will delay the projects indefinitely. Both Mayor McGinn and Mr. Golden will testify here today that they flat out oppose the terminals, and they believe a cumulative, programmatic, or area-wide EIS is what it takes to stop the projects from being built. To their credit, they're being pretty transparent about their goal. Now, I respect their opinions and their positions, but I worry that their quest to stop these projects could have serious consequences for all exports. A cradle-to-grave life cycle impact analysis that includes the environmental impact of the cargo, in this case the coal, would be a very, very dangerous precedent to be setting, because everything we ship has a life cycle environmental impact. So what if the cargo was another fuel or a bulk agricultural product like wheat or corn or soybeans? Would the government need to perform a programmatic EIS to determine the life cycle environmental impact of that? In the case of corn, would the EIS have to look at the environmental impact not only on the transportation of the products, but also the planting, cultivating, growing, and harvesting of the crops? What if the cargo were cars, tractors, electronics, toys, steel, chemicals, pumps, air conditioners? You see where I'm going here. How far up and down the supply chain would agencies be required to go to assess the impact? The possibilities are literally endless and are very, very deeply troubling to manufacturers. When NEPA was enacted in 1969, the intent was to require federal agencies to account for, document, and disseminate to the public the environmental impacts of their actions. Congress's intent in enacting NEPA was not to curtail or significantly delay federal action. NEPA requires excellent action, but there are boundaries to that action, and those boundaries must be respected. Free trade and exports aren't particularly divisive concepts in the United States, but for some reason, and as we're sitting here today, for some reason when you put the word energy in front of export, we all wind up wrapped around the axle. The United States is energy rich and domestic supply will soon exceed demand. Exports of energy are a reality. Manufacturers support an objective, orderly, and ultimately legal permitting process for energy exports. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Eisenberg. Mr. Golden, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Rush, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. My name is K.C. Golden. I am the Policy Director for Climate Solutions. We're a regional organization focusing on promoting practical and profitable solutions to global warming. I'm here today to talk about coal export, not about corn, not about toys, but about coal export. Proposed coal export projects are a very big deal for our region, and so we appreciate your willingness to carefully examine the costs and benefits before proceeding. Northwest citizens and communities are deeply concerned about the impacts of coal export on public health, on property values, on existing jobs, on Main Street businesses, and our economic future. In my brief comments, I will focus primarily on the climate impacts, But I want to emphasize that all of these impacts deserve full and fair consideration before any public decisions are made to issue permits or leases, let alone subsidies for coal export. We take climate disruption very seriously in the Northwest. We have to. Our mountain snowpack is critical economic infrastructure for our region. Our fishing, our farming, our forestry communities depend critically on that snowpack. Our power system is built on it. And like communities everywhere, we are concerned about increasing and growing risks from extreme weather to human life and to human property in the Northwest. And so Washington and Oregon and communities in the Northwest are implementing climate action plans now. We know we can't fix this problem alone, but we're determined to do our part. We're determined to prove up effective solutions in our communities. And the centerpiece of these plans is our transition to a clean energy economy. Our commitments to energy efficiency and to clean energy and to transportation choices are working. Our economy is stronger, our industries are more competitive, our communities are healthier, our emissions are down, and our future is looking up because of these commitments. And so now turning from that strategy to coal exports would be a tragic and abrupt reversal from that successful strategy for the Northwest. And dumping over 100 million tons of coal a year into global energy markets would have significant, irreversible impacts on the climate and therefore on our communities as well. Now, the coal industry argues that our coal would simply replace other sources of supply and not increase net emissions. Our understanding is that supply and demand doesn't work that way. It will only replace other sources of supply insofar as it's cheaper. Otherwise, they wouldn't buy it. And if it's cheaper, then more of it will be consumed. Now, if it turns out to not be cheaper and this coal isn't competitive in these markets, then these projects may well go belly up, as previous coal export projects did, leaving our community with substantial stranded costs. Neither outcome is acceptable to us. Economic modeling of this emissions effect shows that emission increases would be substantial. And even more troubling, they would have the effect of greenlighting the investment of enormous amounts of capital into new coal infrastructure in the fast-growing Asian economies. And by the way, these are coal plants that lack the technology to sequester or responsibly dispose of the carbon. The International Energy Agency has warned that these long-lived, capital-intensive investments would lock in emissions that virtually guarantee dangerous climate disruption. The coal industry disputes this analysis, so instead of trying to exclude analysis of climate impacts from the environmental process, I would suggest that they welcome the opportunity to set the record straight in a rigorous, transparent evaluation of these impacts. This is obviously a much longer discussion than we have time for today, and so let me close by emphasizing this simple request for federal agencies and decision makers. Please examine all of the relevant impacts carefully, rigorously, transparently, and comprehensively, including the climate impacts, before any public permits or subsidies are issued for coal export. Let's look at whether coal leases for export are fair to federal taxpayers and in the public interest before BLM issues any more of them. Let's not be afraid to ask and answer the big questions about how this will affect our economic future and the climate that our kids will live in. These are big, fateful decisions, not just for the region, but for the country. These choices deserve full transparency and public accountability. All we're asking is that we simply look before we leap and make these decisions in the full light of day. Thank you. I look forward to any questions you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Golden. Mr. Pugliese, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Chairman Whitfield, Ranking Member Rush, thank you so much for inviting me to testify on this very important topic. Let's go to the first slide. I have a few graphs I'd like to show you. Let me just say that over the last 10 years, we've had an economic growth rate for the national economy of less than 2%. This is not a problem. This is a national crisis. And I want to start out by seeing what happened with natural gas. You know, if you came here in 2008 and testified on natural gas, and members of the committee asked, what can we do about the shortage of natural gas? Should we lease more land? Shall we try new kinds of innovation? All the government witnesses would have said, it doesn't matter what we do. The path you see there in blue, if you look at the vertical axis, that's trillion cubic feet per year. And in 2008, we all believed that we were going to have massive imports of natural gas. But in fact, because of the advances of hydraulic fracturing, because it occurred on private land, because there was no NEPA review, because ideas could move quickly from one province to another, we rapidly increased our gas supplies. These are very important lessons here. It's not just the technology, it was the whole process. Next slide. The next slide I think, shows us very clearly why the real debate is not whether we're going to export too much natural gas, but whether we may lose out from a highly competitive market and export too little. The vertical axis shows you billion cubic feet per day. And you see that narrow blue line that goes across there? That's the most likely world demand for LNG in the world market between 2020 and 2025. It's a very competitive market. All these projects we have going forward are of should not be of much concern. We don't even need a DOE export process. The capital markets themselves are going to determine who gets these projects. And the real issue for our country is how do we contain the political and the regulatory risk. I can tell you today there is no Canadian pipeline company that will consider building a line across the U.S. border. The experience of Keystone has shifted long-term expectations. This is not a friendly place to do business. Next slide. This shows you the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission timelines for approving projects. Once again, as you can see, it can take up to get the final project up to 9 years. I think we are much too preoccupied with exporting more. The more likely outcome is that we're going to go slowly, very measured, and we may miss out on some markets. Next slide, please. If you just take the projects, which are, you see the vertical axis here is billion cubic feet per day, and these are the projects which have contracts. Actually, these are the projects that are most likely to get permission to proceed. And as you can see, it's very modest, somewhere between 5, 6, maybe 7 billion cubic feet a day. We don't have a process that we should not be worried about exporting too much. That is not our problem. We have to learn that. We have to work on how we can be competitive to get a big part of this market. Next slide. I know we talked about coal today. One of the things that I'd like to point out is that, how you get economic value is that you sell something for more than it costs. And it is true that if we were to expand, you see in the middle there, that this curve shows you what we call the supply curve or merit order curve, the relatively cost of producing coal and delivering it to Asian markets. And the U.S. can expand, for example, in the Powder River Basin, take a lot of that value, and we will, as Mr. Golden pointed out, help to lower the price. But that lowering the price will be very small. And the implications of that lower price will not be substantial on total coal use worldwide. And then finally, the last slide. This is, one sort of presentation of what we call the North American petroleum renaissance. And the vertical axis there shows you both our imports and then our imports when we look at it as a North American entity, U.S. and Canada together, as a percent of GNP. If we can contain our regulatory and political risk, if we can allow a relatively stable set of projects to go forward that the market wants us to do, by 2019, 2020, total non-Canadian, waterborne imports into the United States are going to be virtually insignificant. As you can see, it will probably be well less than 2/10, 3/10 of GNP. And it's for that reason that we need to focus on this huge opportunity of high-valued projects which are for us. We have a large number of high-value projects. For some reason, we can't get permission to proceed.
Well, thank you very much. And I'm going to ask unanimous consent that we include with your statement those slides because I don't think they were formally submitted with them. So we'll include those with them as well. At this time, Mr. Cooper, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Whitfield and Ranking Member Rush, Mr. Barton, and other members of the subcommittee. My name is Bill Cooper. I'm the president of the Center for Liquefied Natural Gas. Thank you for this opportunity to present my views on the regulatory barriers to LNG exports. The Department of Energy has issued 2 exceptionally well-reasoned orders in the Sabine Pass and Freeport cases, which Assistant Secretary Smith, I'll abbreviate his title, Assistant Secretary Smith referenced in his testimony. Both of those orders adhered to the statute, DOE's rules and policies, and the rulings DOE has previously established in its orders it has issued. Such orders provide regulatory certainty to the community of the regulated, and I certainly commend them for their good work. When DOE makes a decision on an application, it is a good decision. The problem is there's no certainty as to when DOE will make a decision, and its effort to establish the order in which it will proceed is unlawful. Effective December 5, 2012, DOE published its Order of Precedence, the Q, informing the public as to the manner in which it would process the 15 applications pending before it and all subsequently filed applications. Preference was given to the pending DOE applications that had received approval from the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission to use the FERC pre-filing process in the order the DOE application was received. All other pending and future DOE applications would be processed thereafter in the order of filing at DOE. Even with its attempt to provide procedural guidance as to the order in which it will consider the applications, DOE did not provide any timelines as to when those decisions would be forthcoming. After 15 applicants reasonably relied upon the only rules DOE had published, DOE changed those rules by predicating when it would consider each application, not based upon when those applications were filed at DOE, but based upon when an applicant filed with another agency, and DOE announced that decision after the fact. While many may argue about the conditions of the queue, namely when an applicant filed with FERC or whether contracts should be in place, that is not the issue. The issue is the establishment of the queue in the first place. For if it is accepted that a federal agency can amend its rules by agency decree and apply those amendments retroactively, there could be no end to the process and no regulatory certainty. The result would be an agency repeal of the congressionally mandated Administrative Procedures Act. DOE's issuance of its order of precedence for the queue is unlawful for the following reasons. Number one, the establishment and use of the queue is in essence an amendment to the rules promulgated by DOE as set forth in Title 10 of the Code of Federal Regulations, Part 590, and therefore is subject to the same notice and comment requirements as the original rules. Notice of the queue was not published in the Federal Register with an opportunity for the public to comment. The failure to provide such notice and comment renders the queue void. Any amendment to an existing rule cannot be applied retroactively, thus rendering the queue ineffective as to the 15 pending applications at the time of the queue's issuance, even if the queue was properly issued, which it was not. DOE should acknowledge that the queue was not properly issued and should proceed with its determinations of all pending applications based upon its lawfully established rules. With the queue being void, it cannot be applied even to the applications filed after the announcement of the queue. DOE should proceed with its determinations of all pending applications within a reasonable time from the closing of the time periods set forth in the Federal Register. The mere passage of time does nothing to add to the evidentiary record upon which DOE must base its decision. That evidentiary record closed when the public comment period closed. Any federal agency should adhere to its rules. No matter how noble the intentions of an agency may be, placing retroactive duties upon applicants when it is too late for those applicants to do anything about it undermines the rule of law, the need for regulatory certainty, and the demands of justice. Thank you for the opportunity to present my views today.
Mr. Cooper, thank you, and thank all of you for your testimony. At this time, I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes. Recently, I had a friend who had attended the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland, and when he came back, he was talking about so much of the discussion over there was about the energy situation in America and how the Europeans and many parts of the world were genuinely concerned about the abundance of energy that we have in America. The new oil finds, the new shale gas finds, the reserve of coal that we have. And they recognize that America is really at a point that we did not expect to be not too many years ago, that we do have the ability to be energy independent, strong energy security. And when we were preparing for this hearing, I was thinking about, well, what are the obstacles to export? And there are divergent views on this panel, and that's why we have panels, that's why we have open discussions, that's why we have debate, to get that out there. But in my view, the major obstacle to energy exports from this country is the Obama administration. And when he was running for president, he really didn't talk a lot about global or climate change issues in most parts of the country. But yet, if the Council on Environmental Quality, as a result of President Obama's action, does require consideration of both the increase in greenhouse gases and a project's vulnerability to flooding, drought, or other extreme weather that might result from global warming, it's going to transform the way any project will be considered or have the opportunity to be built in our country. It will be a major bottleneck. And what it illustrates to me is that in the energy sector, the most important issue to this administration is global warming, more important than any job outside of the green energy sector, more important than the trade deficit of last year, $455 billion, $573 billion, more important than that. More important than the opportunity to reduce global poverty and increase the standard of living because of the millions of people in the world who do not have electricity. And that's why companies are coming to America to ask for our energy. And yet this president and his administration are making a statement that global warming is more important than anything else when it comes to energy. And we need to have a national debate about it, because I tell you what, the greenhouse, under the Clean Air Act, you look at pollutant, anything can be a pollutant. In the Massachusetts EPA case, they said that it's up to the EPA to make a decision. And they did their endangerment finding, and they decided they're going to regulate greenhouse gases. So if they come out with this regulation where we cannot even build a new coal-powered plant, even though the new plants our emissions are much lower than the old plants, and then if they go further and start regulating existing plants, then America is going to find itself in a very difficult situation, particularly when it comes to being competitive in the global marketplace to attract industry for jobs. Now, I'm all for green energy, and we can talk about all sorts of green energy projects that work and all sorts that fail. Right across the line in Tennessee, 20 miles from my hometown of Hopkinsville, Hemlock Corporation spent $1.3 billion building a plant for component parts of solar panels. They said they were going to create 2,500 jobs. They built a $20 million railroad line into that plant, and they received about $200 million of stimulus funds. And 3 years ago, they started construction. In January, they announced they're not even going to open this plant. So the danger from my perspective is that the government is trying to dictate what energy will be used instead of letting the American people in the marketplace really decide that issue. So this has been a very helpful hearing for me personally. I want to thank all of you for testifying. We have many challenges ahead of us, and my time's expired, so I recognize the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Rush, for 5 minutes.
I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, and you have used your time to let your feelings be known. I think we understand or know how you feel now. But I want to formulate my questions on a different kind of path. In the first panel, I talked a lot about jobs and the cost of doing business, and on the prices that the American people will be confronted with. So I'd like to ask each of you, since you're on the front line, the question of what would be the net impact on prices, on jobs, from your perspective, if we were to export LNG and coal. And notwithstanding the treatise from my friend from Kentucky, Hopkinsville, Kentucky, I would like to know, do you have any concerns about climate change also, and what are those concerns? So, Mr. McGinn, if you would just start, what would be the net impact on prices and jobs for the American people?
Well, I think we look at clearly there are jobs in the production and transport of coal and the shipping of it, but we look at the impact on our economic activities in our cities and towns along the length of that train route, and we see negative impacts. You also have the health impacts. For example, 200 doctors in Bellingham spoke about the impacts of diesel exhaust and coal dust on people living near an export facility. We know in particular those can hit some of our minority communities harder who live closer to those train tracks or closer to the facilities. I mentioned the Lummi Indians' concern, who have lived for centuries on salmon, and their concern about the effects on salmon. So we see all of the positive economic activity in Seattle and our region, and the coal trains concern us. And of course we're worried about climate change, because what we do is we export the coal, and it comes back to us in the form of mercury emissions, which find their way into fish and find their way into all of our bodies. Comes back in the form of global warming, which has potentially devastating effects on our economy and quality of life. And that's why we, again, keep pointing to what we believe are more productive ways to create jobs.
Thank you, Congressman. Just to follow up on the mayor's comments, I would say this. I've already documented the economic lift from coal exports, 1,300 high-wage jobs for every million tons we export. I would say if you're concerned about the impact on your locality, I respect your opinion since you're a resident, but I'd say let's go to Virginia, to Norfolk, let's go to Baltimore, let's go to New Orleans, let's go down to the Gulf in Houston, Galveston, and I think you'll find that those ports exporting amounts of coal, they are most welcoming that economic activity and found those ports good neighbors. In terms of climate change, let me assure you that if you needed to write an EIS on what the impact is, it would be as follows. Stopping U.S. coal exports will not make any material change in global emissions of CO2. What it will do is it will deny the opportunity of billions of people accessing electricity, modern energy, as coal has over the last 2 decades.
I would like to hear from
and it will cost millions of jobs in the United States.
Mr. Eisenberg.
Thank you, Congressman. For speaking on both, and I'm not an economist, but I've read almost every study on the issue in terms of just about every study that's been done on LNG and coal exports. Almost every single one of them comes out with a net increase, including the ones that the government has put together, a net increase in jobs and minimal, if any, impacts on price. Again, those are studies not done by us, but some of them have been done by the government. That is almost pretty much uniformly what they say. On climate, manufacturers are committed to reducing greenhouse gas emissions to being more efficient, to coming up with the technologies that will deal with climate change. It's a serious issue, and we take it very, very seriously. But again, as Mr. Quinn said, this is this really, I mean, the issue that we're talking about today in the context of coal exports is, does climate belong in the NEPA review on a Section 10 Rivers and Harbors Act or a Section 404 permit to dredge and fill area for ships? And the answer really is no. Legally, it's no. And so, it just does not belong as part of this. We do think that we are at the table for a conversation on climate, but just not it doesn't belong legally in the context of this.
Gentleman's time's expired. Chair recognizes himself for 5 minutes. Mr. Cooper, when we passed the Energy Policy Act back in 2005, I believe that you were a staff member of the majority staff and helped do the staff work on the conference report. Is that correct?
I was a staffer on the Energy Policy Act of 2003. Many of those provisions made it into the 2005 Act, but I had left the Hill at that point in time.
See, I thought you were here in 2005. You just took my question.
Maybe I should have been.
Okay. Well, then I won't ask the question that I was going to ask. I'll make a brief statement, and then I'm going to ask a few questions. None of these projects are going to be done if they don't make economic sense. Does everybody agree with that?
Yes.
I mean, you don't agree, Mr. Golden, you don't agree with that? Why would somebody put money into a project that doesn't make economic sense?
We've had at least 2 coal export facilities sited, built on the West Coast, and abandoned for lack of global markets. I think the global markets are extremely volatile. I think
that's
people
a different.
are making
That's a
bet.
different.
It may or may not turn out.
At the time that they were built, there was an expectation by their developers that they did make economic sense. Do you agree with that?
Sure. It just turned out to be wrong.
Yeah. Well, that's the market. A lot of people run for Congress with the expectation they'll win. They come up with a shortage of votes, and they don't meet expectations. So, but if you go from the premise that no matter how good the project is, if it doesn't pass an economic test, one, it's probably not going to be built. I will agree with Mr. Golden that sometimes rosy-colored glasses work, but it's certainly not going to sustain itself. So that when we look at these LNG facilities and when we look at the coal export facilities, we start with the premise that the people that are going to purchase the products overseas think they will help their nations and their people, and the expectation is that the people that are developing the projects to sell the natural gas or the coal believes that it will make sense economically here. Now, in the sense of the coal exports, there's really no requirement in federal law for any kind of a public interest test. Is that not correct?
Well, there's nothing, of course, Congressman, such as LNG is going through in terms of whether it's in the public interest to export.
Because
the public interest test in the context, in a different context for the 404 permits that we have to go through to get the
right. See, because when the various federal laws that govern energy policy were passed, coal has never been considered to be something that is in a shortage potential situation.
Correct.
So the reason that natural gas has some constraints on its export is because for the last 40 to 50 years there have been large periods of time where we thought that we were going to have natural gas shortages in the United States. So we wanted to reserve that product for domestic use. We're now in a situation where we have a potential surplus, and all the indicators are that surplus is going to grow. But even in the case of natural gas, the premise is that it is in the public interest to be exported, and you have to prove otherwise. So my question is to the panel, this latest Department of Energy decision to put a variable of cumulative impact, that's nowhere seen in any federal law that I've read. Does anybody point to a statute that requires a variable called cumulative impact? Mr. Pugliese, you're shaking your head.
I think the critical issue here is these are very expensive, capital-intensive projects, and buyers and sellers are not going to come together if they have a lot of uncertainty in how the government's going to behave. This is the problem, and it's a worldwide market, and we want to capture that extra value, because out of that extra value comes revenues to state, federal, and local governments, return on capital, construction, and sustainable economic growth. The biggest problem we've had in the last 10 years is that we have lots of high-valued projects with enormous economic value to the national economy, and we can't get permission from the government.
Well, my time has expired, but I plan on sitting down with Chairman Whitfield and Mr. Rush, and hopefully come up with some questions for the record where we send to the Department of Energy to have them clarify a little bit more their statutory authority for using cumulative impact and to more properly define exactly what that is. With that, my time has expired, and I want to yield to the gentleman from New York for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mayor McGinn, you described a number of ways in which a new coal export terminal could affect local communities. And you further developed that with the ranker on the committee, Representative Rush. What are the city and state doing to examine and quantify the potential impact of increased coal train traffic on air quality? Is there anything being done in that regard?
Yeah, there's a couple of things. One is a local University of Washington researcher is doing research on both the effects of the coal dust and diesel exhaust along the route. That requires setting up monitoring stations along the length of the route to understand the impacts. And he actually ended up crowdsourcing the funding for that. He was concerned that he wouldn't be able to get it from traditional sources, but he is doing that work. There's the Puget Sound Regional Council, which is our regional planning agency for transportation and economic purposes, is looking at a region-wide analysis of that would be the 4 counties that comprise it, which are around central Puget Sound. So those are 2 of the analyses that are underway right now, and we're also looking at a health impacts analysis as well.
Thank you. And Mr. Eisenberg's testimony directly challenges the merits of your request for a comprehensive programmatic environmental review of all of the coal terminal proposals. And I believe the witness argues that assessing the environmental impacts of each terminal on its own should be deemed adequate. And we heard from Ms. Moyer from the Army Corps of Engineers with a similar viewpoint in her testimony. Why do you think it's important to examine all of the terminal proposals together rather than individually?
Well, it's embedded within the National Environmental Protection Act and our State Environmental Protection Act that you should look before you leap. You should understand the impacts of a decision before making it. We've clearly identified a wide range of impacts along the entire length of the line. I think the question that was raised by Ms. Castor was right on point. Shouldn't some agency of government be evaluating all of the impacts, including, of course, the cumulative impacts that come from climate change? So I do not believe the decision of the Army Corps of Engineers should be allowed to stand. If we're going to understand the implications of this decision, we need to look at all the impacts. And I would say that both the governors of Oregon and Washington have made the same request.
Thank you. And Mr. Golden, again, the witness, Mr. Eisenberg, says a life cycle analysis of the climate change impacts of exported coal would be a mistake. He says that if the climate impacts of coal exports are examined, there will be no limit to the analysis of the climate impacts at every step of the supply chain. I'm interested in your response to that concern.
Well, as I said, I'm not here to testify about corn or toys, but about coal export. That question is actually a very important question in designing a comprehensive climate policy. Where do you look at the impacts? Where do you assess accountability for those emissions? Unless I mistake the committee's intentions, we're not designing a comprehensive climate policy today. I hope I'll be called again when you decide to. But in this case, the choices before us are simply, do we look at the climate impacts of this proposal or not? And given that those impacts are prospectively very large, and I understand that's disputed, but let's argue about that, given that those impacts are irreversible, I simply think it would be irresponsible not to look at them as part of the decision-making process.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of the approach of taking project-by-project assessment of potential climate change, is there a better approach than that? Or
I think it's very important to look at this comprehensively. You know, some of these local decision makers, you have county commissioners and others who are looking at these permits in their jurisdictions, and I think we can forgive them for saying, you know, some of these things, the rail impacts east of the mountains in other communities or the climate impacts are a little above my pay grade. The responsible agencies ought to take a comprehensive look at that. I don't think we can afford to close our eyes. If the Army Corps decides that, you know, within a very narrow, legalistic interpretation of its responsibility and control, it can't do that, then I think we should find somebody who can.
Seeing that my time is elapsed, I will yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. At this time, I recognize the gentleman from West Virginia, Mr. McKinley, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mayor, when's your election coming up? Don't you have something coming up soon?
It's yes, it is indeed. This August is a primary. This November is a general.
So this makes a good photo op here, doesn't it? Mayor, I've got a couple questions for you. When I read through your testimony, because it seemed like maybe you left some things out that you had talked about. One is you referenced, and maybe I didn't hear it right because I don't hear as well as I should. But on page 4, you talk about on mining leases on public lands that there is in your words, a massive subsidy for coal companies. I've got a copy of the report, and I haven't found the word subsidy in there at all. Can you tell me where I would find the word subsidy that you're referring to?
You know, and I think this goes back to the issue that the chairman was talking about
Can you just tell me where it is?
Well, if you will, it goes back to this issue the chairman was talking about whether the marketplace, is letting this go.
These are sealed bids, are they not, Mayor? And they don't have to reject. They can accept them or reject them. There's no check. There's no subsidy to these companies, and you know that. This is just a matter of whether you didn't like the bids that were received with that. But I'm more troubled. With.
You're testifying now, Congressman, and it's your committee.
I think you're challenging me on the thing, and that, Mayor, you're here before us.
I understand that, and I appreciate the opportunity.
On page 3, you had a more troubling, and I thought it sent a shiver up my spine, and it should for anyone from a coal-producing area. When you said on page 3 that we should keep our coal in the ground where it belongs, did you really mean that?
Yes, I did.
That we shouldn't be mining or using coal in America?
Well, this gets us to the fundamental issue of climate change, and this is the difference between corn and toys and the other things that were mentioned. The difference here is that we have taken huge quantities of fossil fuels from beneath the surface of the earth and put them into the atmosphere with potentially devastating effects upon the future of us and future generations as well.
You're entitled to have that opinion about climate change. It's throughout there. I'm willing to acknowledge that there is climate change going on. The question I'm still trying to determine as an engineer, I'm one of 2 engineers in Congress, is whether or not the climate change is caused by man or is it natural and cyclical. We can come to the agreement that it's changing. We know that. But you seem to be saying to so many on the other side that it's all due to man and burning coal or fossil fuels, and that just simply does. That's why there's an ongoing debate with it, and you're coming from your position. But with all due respect, you coming here and trying to lecture us about climate change, Mayor, I would strongly suggest you take a look at the crime rate in Seattle. than
I'd be happy to look.
Washington, when you have 94% of the cities across America have a lower crime rate than you have in that city.
Well, that's actually
3,707 violent crimes in your community and 33,248 last year with it. I think you ought to take a look at
We
that.
have one of the lowest crime rates of a large
us not
city
to
in the
burn
country.
coal in
And we are at
America,
a
I think we
30-year
better take
low
a
for our
look at
crime rate, Congressman.
Yield back my
And we're proud of our police force and the work they do fighting crime.
Gentleman yield back. At this time, I recognize the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Griffith, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Gwynn. Virginia ranks 12th in the U.S. in total coal production. Of that total, 43% or nearly 11 million short tons of Virginia coal was exported abroad. Now, my district and other districts that have coal have been greatly impacted by a lot of the regulations that have come out. If exports are also taken away, what do you think is going to happen to the economy in the regions that I represent? Is it going to get better or is it going to get worse?
Well, clearly worse, Congressman, Southwest Virginia. And frankly, the export market is a key market because it has better margins, and a lot of that coal goes for metallurgical, steel making in Europe, as well as steam. So it's very important there.
Yeah. I knew that was going to be the answer, but I did want to get that question out on the record. And the jobs that we have been seeing that we've lost almost monthly, we've had announcements of people losing those jobs, and I think it was either you or Mr. Eisenberg, somebody mentioned that when you add in the benefits, you're almost at $100,000 a year, and most people don't realize coal miners today make somewhere around $75,000 a year, and then you add in benefits, who knows how high that goes. And so these are good paying jobs. I would also point to you and ask you, Mr. Pugliese, that you mentioned something about the impacts on local, state, and the federal government. And one of my counties, the income that they receive from taxes in the county, not assistance they get from the federal government or from the state government, there's estimates that as much as 70% of that money comes from the coal severance tax that Virginia has. So when we cut back on coal exports, we're actually cutting money to the schools in a number of the counties in my district, and I think you are aware of that. Is that correct?
Yeah. Yes, and I think, we're sort of missing the point. We always, I don't care what we're talking about, we always talk about, well, we need more jobs. And of course we need more jobs. But we could return our economy to 17th century agriculture. And we could all go to work tomorrow. But we'll be very poor. We have these fossil fuels whose value in the marketplace is substantially above their cost of production. And all that value can come to us. And it doesn't just come to the owners. It comes to state and local federal governments. It comes to economic growth and sustainable growth.
And to our children and to our
that value,
grandchildren.
we should not give it up cavalierly.
I don't disagree with that at all. And in fact, politically, we'd be better off as well because, as somebody mentioned, and I've heard so much good testimony today, somebody mentioned that the other nations of the world are aggressively pursuing the markets, Australia, Canada. If we don't pursue this market, they will get those markets. And wouldn't we be in a better position when we have a disagreement perhaps with our colleagues in China if they are reliant on using our coal resources to generate their manufacturing?
I think that if you look in the place, for example, natural gas, Prime Minister Abe visited us, visited President Obama recently. There was no announcement made, and I thought that was unfortunate because these exports are also elements of soft power for us.
No question.
When our allies look at us and say, well, we're a supplier of LNG, we're a supplier of petroleum products.
Well, I'm going to get you a speculation here. I speculate, and I wonder if you do too, that part of the reason that we're suddenly talking about a trade agreement with the Europeans might actually be because of our large supply of natural gas. Do you think that might be one of the things that they're discussing over in Ireland as we speak?
I'm sure it's an element.
I'm sure it's an element as well. Mr. Cooper, a study by the National Economic Research Associates Group states that natural gas price increases at the time LNG exports could begin range from 0 to 0.33 MCF per 1,000 cubic feet. I always just call it the unit that we use to measure how much it costs. Given these figures and the fact that we haven't tapped into all of our natural gas resources like those off the shore, off the coast of Virginia and other East Coast states, do you think if we export natural gas that it's going to have any major impact on the cost of natural gas in this country?
No. Every credible report that has been conducted that's examined the price impacts due to LNG exports have said it would be minimal, if at all.
And so the bottom line, as I'm hearing the testimony today, is that we actually strengthen ourselves in the world. We create more wealth in the United States if we are allowed to export our natural resources, of which we have an abundant supply that will last us for quite some time. And I'm concerned that when the time comes and we have to deal with whatever issues are facing the country, if we're a poorer nation, it makes it a lot harder for us to deal with those issues. If we're a richer nation, we've got the resources to deal with whatever issues may confront us. And last but not least, I'll get my plug in again for this project with chemical looping with hardly any pollution at all, because I think this could actually be an answer to problems that all of us are concerned about, and find a resolution for our nation and move us forward. I thank you and yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Griffith. Do you have anything else?
No, I don't have any other questions, Mr. Chairman. I just didn't realize, I mean, this is a new day for this subcommittee. We have come upon the intersection between coal and crime. I never thought that we'll see this day here in this committee.
Well, that's
never ceased to amaze me, this committee, this subcommittee.
That's why this committee is so interesting. And Mr. Cooper, if you wouldn't mind just providing the committee your thoughts on the criteria that DOE should use in deciding what order to proceed on these pending applications. You talked about that a little bit in your testimony. Would you mind just giving us your views on that?
Yes, sir. The existing Code of Federal Regulations, which contain the promulgated rules by the Department of Energy, essentially set forth the contents of the applications that are required, which involve where the gas is coming from, how abundant the natural gas supply is, the commercial terms of the arrangements. And the public interest standard, while Congress said it, did not put a lot of criteria, actually no criteria on it, and that's been developed over the years. We don't particularly have any issues with the fact that the agency can develop that public interest standard as it adjudicates the cases over time. We think that the role of Congress to set policy and the role of any regulatory agency to flush out that policy on a case-by-case basis is sound. Even the cumulative impacts that was discussed previously do not particularly concern us if they're handled within the promulgated rules and the structures that DOE has in place, and not to change that after the applicants have already filed to where they can't respond. What I mean by that is when we look at when DOE looks at cumulative impacts, if it looks at the existing facilities compared to the existing supply picture, we think that that will justify the issuance of these applications for LNG exports. The question is the timing.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Cooper. And I want to thank you all again. I know some of you came very long distances, and we appreciate your making the trek across the country or from wherever. We appreciate your testimony and look forward to working with all of you as we move forward. And with that, the hearing is adjourned, and the record will remain open for 10 days for any additional materials. Thank you.